Sometimes the hardest thing in life isn't surviving the storm. It's learning to let someone in after you've been alone for so long. And sometimes the family you need finds you when you least expect it. In the winter of 1878, 3 children in Wyoming Territory found a dying man in the snow after a brutal storm. They brought him home to their widowed mother, never knowing this stranger would become the father they'd been praying for. His name was Jacob Brennan, a mountain man who'd spent 20 years running from his past. The children, Emma, Thomas, and little Sarah, had lost their father 2 years before. What happened next changed all their lives. Could a man who'd forgotten how to love become the father these children needed? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Carter homestead sat in a small valley where the wind always found a way through, no matter how carefully you chinked the logs. Catherine Carter had learned that lesson 2 winters ago, along with 100 other hard truths about survival that no one tells you until you're living them alone. The cabin itself was modest. 2 rooms that Daniel had built with his own hands 7 years back, when they'd first claimed this piece of Wyoming territory. He'd promised her he'd add on when the children got older, when they had more put by. That addition never came. Now Catherine stood at the window watching snow blow across the yard in white sheets, wondering how she'd make it through another season with 3 children depending on her for everything. She was 32 years old, though some days she felt twice that. Her hands, once smooth and careful with needlework, were now rough from chopping wood and mending fence lines. Her dark hair, which Daniel used to love running his fingers through, she kept pulled back in a severe bun. No time for vanity when there was work from sunup to sundown. But her eyes, deep brown and steady, those hadn't changed. They still held the same determination that had brought her west as a young bride, still carried the same love for her children that made every sacrifice worthwhile. The children were her world now. Everything she did, every decision she made, was for them. Emma was 12, the oldest, and Catherine saw too much of herself in that girl. She'd grown serious these past 2 years, taking on responsibilities no child should have to carry. She helped with the cooking, watched over her younger siblings, never complained even when Catherine knew she was exhausted. Sometimes Catherine would catch Emma staring at nothing, her young face lined with worry, and it broke her heart. 12 years old, and already she knew what it meant to be afraid. Thomas was 9, all sharp angles and barely contained energy. He'd been close to his father, Daniel's shadow, always wanting to help with the heavy work, learning to handle tools and livestock. When Daniel died, something in Thomas had hardened. He'd become protective of his mother and sisters, almost aggressive about it. Quick to anger, slow to trust, carrying a burden of responsibility that made him seem older than his years. Catherine worried about the anger she saw building in him, the way he'd clench his fists when he thought no one was looking. And then there was Sarah, just 6 years old, still young enough to believe that Papa might come back someday. She asked about him less now than she used to, but Catherine would sometimes find her talking to the empty chair by the fire, where Daniel used to sit, telling him about her day in that sweet, lilting voice. Of all of them, Sarah had kept her lightness, her capacity for joy. Catherine fought every day to protect that innocence, even as the world pressed in harder. The homestead itself was showing signs of their struggle. The fence line had 3 sections that needed mending. Thomas had tried, but he didn't have his father's strength or skill yet. The barn roof leaked in 2 places. They'd lost a cow last month to some sickness Catherine couldn't identify or treat. Their supplies were running lower than she wanted to admit. The root cellar that should have been full enough to last through spring held maybe half of what they needed. The nearest town was 2 days' ride south, and Catherine couldn't make that journey in winter, not with the children. Even if she could, what would she buy supplies with? Daniel had left them the land and the cabin, but precious little money. She'd sold what she could spare, some tools, her mother's china that had come all the way from Pennsylvania. It had bought them time, but time was running out. She touched the wedding ring on her finger, turning it absently. 14 years she'd worn it, Daniel had saved for months to buy it from a jeweler in Cheyenne, presenting it to her the day they'd married, with such pride in his eyes. Worn gold, simple band, but it meant everything. She'd thought about selling it more than once this winter, but couldn't bring herself to do it. It was the last piece of him she wore, the last daily reminder that she'd been loved once, been part of something larger than just survival. "Mama?" Emma's voice pulled her from her thoughts. The girl stood in the doorway of the bedroom, her arms full of mended shirts. "I finished these. Should I start on the socks next?" Catherine felt that familiar tug in her chest, pride mixed with sorrow. "No, honey. You've done enough today. Go play with your sister for a bit. I don't mind." "Emma." Catherine kept her voice gentle but firm. "Go on." The girl nodded and set the shirts down carefully, but Catherine saw the hesitation in her movements. Emma didn't know how to be a child anymore. That was Catherine's fault, maybe, or just the way life was out here. Hard places made hard people, and children grew up fast when they had to. Thomas came in from outside, bringing a blast of cold air with him. His cheeks were red from wind, his coat dusted with snow. "Check the livestock," he reported, his voice trying for adult steadiness. "Everyone's accounted for. But Mama, the north fence—" "I know," Catherine said. "We'll deal with it when the weather clears. It needs fixing now. If the cattle get out—" "Thomas." She moved to him, put her hands on his thin shoulders. He was growing, would be tall like his father, but right now he was still just a boy trying to be a man. "We'll handle it. Together. But not in this storm." He wanted to argue. She could see it in the set of his jaw, that stubborn Carter pride that Daniel had passed down. But he nodded instead. "Yes, ma'am." Sarah appeared from the bedroom, dragging her rag doll behind her. "Mama, can we have a story tonight, please?" Catherine smiled despite her exhaustion. "After supper, if you're all good." "We will be." Sarah bounced on her toes, then ran to the window. "Look how much snow. It's like a blanket on everything." If only snow could keep them warm and fed, Catherine thought. But she didn't say it. Instead, she began preparing their evening meal, salt pork, beans, and the last of their bread. It would be a sparse meal, like most meals lately, but it would fill their bellies. That's what mattered. As she worked, the children settled into their usual evening routines. Emma helped without being asked, moving around the small kitchen with practiced efficiency. Thomas sat by the fire, methodically cleaning his father's old hunting knife. He'd claimed it after Daniel died, kept it sharp, though Catherine prayed he'd never need to use it for anything but cutting rope. Sarah played quietly with her doll, singing a song Daniel used to sing to her. This was their life now. Quiet moments strung together, each day a small victory of survival. Catherine had learned not to look too far ahead, not to think about next month or next year. Just today. Just tonight. Keep them fed, keep them warm, keep them safe. Tomorrow would have to take care of itself. They sat down to supper together as the light outside faded to deep blue. Catherine led them in prayer, the same words every night. "Lord, thank you for this food, for this family, for keeping us together. Watch over us through the night and give us strength for tomorrow. And bring us help," Sarah added softly. "Please bring us help." Catherine's throat tightened. She opened her eyes to find all three children looking at her, and she saw it there, the question they were all too afraid to ask out loud. How much longer could they make it alone? "Amen," she said finally, squeezing Sarah's small hand. After they'd eaten, Catherine kept her promise about the story. She pulled out the worn Bible that had been her mother's, opened it to a familiar passage, and read to them by firelight. The children pressed close, Sarah curled in her lap, Emma and Thomas on either side. This was the best part of every day. These few minutes when they were just a family, not struggling, not scared, just together. When the story ended and she'd tucked the younger ones into bed, Catherine sat alone by the dying fire. Emma had already fallen asleep in the small bedroom the children shared. Thomas would be asleep soon too, though he always fought it, as if staying awake made him more of a man. Catherine pulled Daniel's old coat around her shoulders. It still smelled like him somehow, leather and wood smoke and something indefinably him. She closed her eyes and let herself have this moment, this brief surrender to loneliness. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," she whispered to the empty room. To the ghost of her husband, to God, to anyone who might be listening. They need more than I can give them. They need, she stopped, swallowing hard. What did they need? A father, stability, a future that didn't look like this endless grinding survival. Outside, the wind picked up, howling around the corners of the cabin. Somewhere in the darkness, the storm was building. Catherine added another log to the fire, checked the door was barred, and looked at her wedding ring one more time. Tomorrow, Thomas wanted to check his trap lines despite the weather. She'd probably let him go. He needed to feel useful, needed to contribute. Emma would work on the mending. Sarah would do her lessons, simple as they were. And Catherine would do what she always did, hold them together one more day. She had no way of knowing that tomorrow everything would change, that her children would find something, someone, in the snow that would alter the course of all their lives, that her prayer for help was about to be answered in a way she could never have imagined. For now, she simply climbed into her own cold bed, alone as she'd been for 2 years, and tried not to think about how many more years of alone might stretch ahead of her. The storm outside built to a fury as the night deepened. But inside the Carter cabin, 4 hearts beat on, hoping for spring, hoping for better, hoping for something more than just survival. Help was coming. They just didn't know it yet. The morning after the storm broke, clear and bitterly cold, the kind of cold that made your lungs ache with each breath. Catherine woke before dawn, as she always did, and immediately knew something was different. The wind had stopped. The cabin was silent, except for the soft breathing of her children. She rose quietly, wrapped herself in layers, and stepped outside to assess the damage. What she saw took her breath away, not from fear, but from terrible beauty. The world had been transformed overnight. Snow lay thick as a feather bed across everything, sculpting strange new shapes from familiar landmarks. Drifts reached halfway up the barn walls. The fence posts wore white caps like sentries standing guard, and everything gleamed in the pre-dawn light with an otherworldly purity. Beautiful, deadly. The two things weren't contradictory out here. She was checking the barn when she heard the children stirring inside. Thomas appeared first, already dressed, his face set with that determined expression he wore when he'd made up his mind about something. "I'm checking the trap lines," he announced, not asked. Catherine wanted to say no. The rational part of her knew it was too dangerous, too soon after such a storm. But they needed whatever those traps might have caught. They needed everything they could get. "Take Emma with you," she said finally. "And stay together. If the snow's too deep, you come straight back." No arguments. Thomas nodded solemnly, and Catherine saw Daniel in that nod. The same stubborn responsibility, the same need to provide. It scared her and made her proud in equal measure. Emma bundled Sarah up and brought her outside to help with morning chores, while Thomas prepared for the journey. Catherine packed them what little food she could spare, some dried meat, hard biscuit, a flask of hot tea. "Be careful," she told them, holding Emma's face between her hands. "Watch the weather!" "Watch each other." "We will, Mama," Emma promised, and there was something in her voice, excitement maybe at the adventure of it. God, they were still children, even if life was trying to make them something else. Thomas led the way out, Emma following, and at the last moment Sarah called out, "Can I come, please?" Catherine started to refuse, but Thomas surprised her. "Let her come, Mama. I'll watch her close." She should see the world after a storm. It's something special, so all three went, their small figures growing smaller against the vast white landscape. And Catherine stood watching until they disappeared over the first rise, her heart in her throat the whole time. The children moved through the transformed world with wonder competing with purpose. Thomas led them along the trapline path, though it was barely recognizable under all the snow. The going was slow. The drifts came up to Sarah's waist in places, and even Emma struggled. "It's like walking through clouds," Sarah said, her breath puffing out in small white bursts. "If clouds were cold and wet," Emma laughed, the sound bright and clear in the still air. When was the last time Catherine had heard her daughter laugh like that? Thomas glanced back, and even his serious face softened into something like a smile. They checked the first 3 traps, all empty, the storm having scattered any game. Thomas reset them carefully, his hands steady despite the cold, doing everything exactly as his father had taught him. At the 4th trap, they found a rabbit, frozen solid, but it was something. Thomas removed it with reverence, knowing what this small life meant to their survival. 2 more traps, he said. Then we head back, but they never made it to those traps. Sarah saw it first. She'd been wandering slightly off the path, dragging her feet through the snow to make patterns, when she stopped suddenly. "Thomas, Emma, there's something over there." "Sarah, stay with us," Thomas called, irritation in his voice. But she'd already moved toward whatever she'd seen, and Emma hurried after her. "Thomas, come look at this." He came, still annoyed at the delay, until he saw what they were seeing. Near the frozen creek, where the wind had scoured some of the snow away, there was something dark against all that white. Something large. They approached cautiously, Thomas pulling ahead to place himself between his sisters and whatever it might be. As they got closer, the shape resolved into something impossible and terrible. A man, lying motionless, half covered in snow, one arm stretched out as if reaching for something he'd never quite managed to grasp. Emma gasped. Sarah made a small, frightened sound. Thomas froze, his hand instinctively going to the knife at his belt. "Is he—" Emma couldn't finish the question. Thomas moved closer, his heart hammering. The man was face down, wearing buckskin and furs, his hair long and dark with frost. Thomas could see ice crystals in his beard. He looked like he'd been carved from the winter itself. "He's dead," Thomas said flatly. "We should go back." But Sarah had crept closer, her natural fearlessness overcoming her initial shock. "Wait, look." She pointed at the man's back. "He's breathing, see? Just a little bit." Thomas looked again, and his heart sank as he realized she was right. The man's back rose and fell, barely, but movement nonetheless. He was alive. Barely. Impossibly, but alive. "We have to help him," Emma said immediately. "No!" Thomas's voice was sharp. "We don't know him. He could be dangerous. We should get Mama. By the time we get back, he'll be dead for certain," Emma argued. "Thomas, look at him. He's dying right now." Thomas stared at the stranger, and a war raged inside him. His instinct was to protect his family, and strangers meant danger. But he could hear his father's voice in his memory, clear as day. "We help when we can, son. That's what makes us human. If we try to move him and he dies anyway, it's a waste," Thomas said. But his protest was weakening. Sarah had already knelt beside the man, her small hand touching his shoulder gently. "Hello, can you hear me? We want to help you." No response. The man lay utterly still, except for those shallow, desperate breaths. Emma knelt on the other side, already assessing with a practicality beyond her years. "He's got frostbite on his hands. His lips are blue. But he's strong. Look at the size of him. If we can get him warm, maybe—" "Emma, we can't carry him," Thomas protested. "He's twice my size." But Emma was already looking around, her mind working. "The travois. The one Papa built. It's in the barn, but we could make another. Just something to drag him on." Thomas wanted to argue more, but looking at his sisters' faces, Emma's determined, Sarah's pleading, he knew he'd already lost. More than that, he knew what his father would have done. What his mother would do. "Fine," he said roughly. "But if he dies, it's not our fault. And if he's dangerous when he wakes up, You'll what?" Emma asked gently. Thomas didn't have an answer. He was 9 years old, with a hunting knife and false bravado. But he said, "I'll protect you both." That's what. They worked quickly, fashioned a rough sledge from fallen branches and leather straps Thomas had brought for the traps. It took all 3 of them to roll the man onto it, and even then he was dead weight, terrifyingly still. Up close, they could see more of him, the weathered face of someone who'd lived hard. Scars on his hands, clothes that spoke of years in the wilderness. Around his neck, frozen against his chest, hung what looked like a leather cord with something attached to it. But it was buried under his coat. In one hand, still clutched with a grip even death hadn't loosened, was a compass. The glass was cracked, and the whole thing was frozen solid, the needle pointing nowhere. What's he doing out here? Sarah wondered. Nothing good, Thomas muttered, but he was already helping to pull the sledge. The journey home took twice as long as the trip out. The man was heavy, the snow was deep, and they had to stop frequently to rest. Thomas pulled from the front, Emma pushed from behind, and Sarah walked alongside, holding the man's frozen hand and talking to him in her gentle, lilting voice. "We're taking you somewhere warm. Our mama will know what to do. She knows everything. You just have to hold on a little longer, okay?" "Can you do that?" The man didn't respond, but somehow they all felt better hearing Sarah's voice in the silence. By the time they crested the final rise and saw the cabin, all three children were exhausted and soaked through. Catherine must have been watching for them because she came running out before they'd made it halfway across the yard. "Mama," Emma called. "We found him. He's alive." Catherine's face went through a series of emotions: confusion, shock, fear, and finally something like resignation. She reached them and looked down at the stranger, taking in his condition with one experienced glance. "Inside," she said simply. "Now, get him by the fire." "Mama, we don't know who he is," Thomas said, voicing what they were all thinking. Catherine met her son's eyes. "No, but we know what he is. He's a man who'll die if we don't help him." "That's enough." Together the four of them dragged the sledge to the cabin, up the steps, through the door. They positioned him as close to the fire as they dared, and Catherine immediately began working, checking his breathing, his pulse, the frostbite on his extremities. "Emma, boil water. Thomas, bring every blanket we have. Sarah, stay out of the way, but keep that fire fed." The children moved to obey, and Catherine knelt beside the stranger, beginning the long process of trying to bring a man back from the edge of death. She worked his frozen coat off, revealing more of him, a strong frame gone gaunt from hard living, old scars crisscrossing his torso, the kind of body that told stories of violence survived. When she removed his outer layers, something fell from his coat pocket, a worn leather journal, the pages warped from moisture but intact. Catherine set it aside, focused on the man himself. She'd learned basic medicine from her mother, who'd served as a midwife and healer in their Pennsylvania town. She knew about frostbite, hypothermia, the slow and careful process of warming someone without shocking their system. But as she worked, cutting away his frozen boots to examine his feet, checking his fingers, she found herself wondering who this man was. Mountain man, clearly. His clothes and gear told her that. But what was he doing out in that storm? Why was he alone? And what would happen if he woke up? Thomas stood by the door, his father's knife in his hand, watching. Emma helped her mother with quiet efficiency. Sarah had positioned herself at the man's head, still talking to him in that soft, encouraging voice. "You're safe now. We've got you. You just rest and get better, okay?" Night fell as Catherine worked, and still the man's condition remained uncertain. His breathing was shallow, his heartbeat weak. Fever began to set in, his body's desperate attempt to fight the cold that had nearly killed him. He started to mumble, incoherent words that made no sense, thrashing slightly. Catherine had to hold him down, and she was surprised by the strength still in him, even in this weakened state. Thomas moved to help, and together they kept him from hurting himself. In his delirium, the man spoke fragments. "Sorry, couldn't get back, not enough time. Margaret, oh God! Margaret, I'm sorry." Catherine's chest tightened. Margaret, a wife. Someone waiting for him somewhere? Or someone lost, given the anguish in his voice? The children had fallen asleep one by one, exhausted from their ordeal. Only Catherine remained awake, sitting vigil beside this stranger who'd fallen into their lives like snow from a dark sky. She picked up the journal that had fallen from his pocket, hesitated, then opened it. If he died, she should at least know his name, know where to send word. But inside there was no name, just page after page of careful sketches. Mountains, trees, animals, plants, each one labeled with notes in a precise hand. Medicinal uses, locations, seasons. The work of someone who knew the wilderness intimately, who'd studied it with careful attention, but nowhere in all those pages was there a single drawing of a person. Not one human face, just the natural world, rendered in careful detail, beautiful and utterly lonely. Catherine closed the journal and looked at the man again. "Who are you?" she wondered. "And why were you alone in that storm?" She would get her answers eventually, but for now, all she could do was try to keep him alive through the night. This stranger who'd stumbled into their lives, bringing with him questions and complications they couldn't afford. Outside, the stars came out clear and cold over the Wyoming territory. Inside the Carter cabin, 5 hearts beat, 4 who belonged there, and one who'd yet to prove whether he was salvation or threat. Catherine added another log to the fire and settled in for the long night ahead, wondering what dawn would bring. Wondering if she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life or answered a prayer she hadn't quite known how to speak. 3 days passed in a blur of fevered vigilance and careful nursing. Catherine barely slept, catching moments of rest in the chair beside the stranger's makeshift bed near the fire. The children helped where they could, but mostly they watched with wary curiosity as their mother fought to keep this unknown man alive. Jacob Brennan, though they didn't know his name yet, drifted between consciousness and delirium. In his fever dreams, he spoke fragments of a past that Catherine could only piece together in glimpses. Names, Margaret James, places, settlements she'd never heard of, mountains he'd clearly known intimately, and always, threaded through it all, a tone of profound regret that made her chest ache, even as she reminded herself he was a stranger. On the morning of the 4th day, his fever finally broke. Catherine was dozing in her chair, exhausted beyond measure, when she sensed the change. She opened her eyes to find him looking at her, truly looking, with clear eyes that held confusion and something like shame, where his voice came out as barely a rasp. Catherine sat forward, reaching for the water she'd kept near. "Don't try to talk yet. Here, drink slowly." She helped him sip, and he did so gratefully, his eyes never leaving her face. When he'd had enough, he lay back, clearly exhausted from even that small effort. "My children found you in the snow," Catherine said quietly, 4 days ago. "You were nearly frozen to death." He closed his eyes, processing this. When he opened them again, there was something in his expression, not quite gratitude, but perhaps acknowledgement of a debt he hadn't wanted to owe. "Your children," he said carefully. They're all right?" The question surprised her. In his position, most men would have asked about themselves first. "They're fine, sleeping. It's early yet." He nodded slightly, then seemed to take in his surroundings, the cabin, the fire, the humble but cared-for space. "I should go, soon as I'm able. I don't want to be a burden." "You can't even sit up yet," Catherine said with more asperity than she'd intended. "You'll go when you're well enough to survive the journey, and not before. I didn't spend 3 days keeping you alive, just to watch you walk out and die of exposure." Something that might have been a smile flickered across his weathered face. "No, ma'am." "I suppose not." They sat in silence for a moment, the fire crackling between them. Catherine found herself studying him more carefully, now that he was awake. He was older than she'd first thought, perhaps 50, perhaps more, though hard living made age difficult to judge. His face was deeply lined, his hands scarred and rough. But his eyes, now that fever didn't cloud them, were surprisingly clear, a light grey that reminded her of winter sky. "I'm Catherine Carter," she said finally. "This is my homestead. My late husband's homestead, properly speaking." "Jacob," he said after a pause. "Jacob Brennan." Another pause, as if he was deciding what else to share. "I'm sorry for the trouble, and for your loss." Before Catherine could respond, she heard stirring from the bedroom. Sarah appeared first, her hair wild from sleep, and stopped dead when she saw the stranger awake and looking at her. "Hello," Jacob said gently, and Catherine was surprised by the softness in his voice. Sarah stared at him for a long moment, then broke into a delighted smile. "You're awake! Emma Thomas!" "He's awake!" The other 2 children tumbled out of the bedroom, and suddenly the cabin felt very small, with all of them crowded around staring at the man by the fire. Jacob looked distinctly uncomfortable with the attention. "These are my children," Catherine said. Emma, Thomas, and Sarah. They're the ones who found you. Jacob's eyes moved from face to face, and Catherine saw something shift in his expression, something that looked almost like pain. "You saved my life," he said simply. "All of you. I'm in your debt." Thomas, who'd been hanging back with his arms crossed, spoke up sharply. "We don't want anything from you. Mama says we help people who need it. That's all." "Thomas," Catherine said warningly, but Jacob shook his head slightly. "He's right to be cautious. You don't know me. For all you know, I could be—" He stopped, seemed to reconsider. "Well, I'm grateful regardless." Emma, ever the practical one, asked, "Are you hungry? You haven't eaten anything but broth for days." "I am," Jacob admitted, "but I don't want to take food you might need." "We have enough," Catherine said, though they both knew it was only barely true. "Emma, can you manage some porridge?" As Emma moved to the stove, Sarah edged closer to Jacob, her natural fearlessness overcoming any shyness. "What's your name?" "I'm Sarah. I'm 6 years old. I held your hand when we brought you home." "Did you know that?" "You were very cold." A genuine smile softened Jacob's face. "Sarah, that's a fine name." "And no, I didn't know, but I'm grateful. You must be very brave to help a stranger." "I'm not scared of anything," Sarah announced proudly, then reconsidered. "Well, I'm scared of thunder, and sometimes the dark, but not people. Those are reasonable things to be scared of," Jacob said seriously. "The dark can hide all sorts of troubles, and thunder means lightning, which demands respect." Catherine found herself relaxing slightly. There was something about the way he spoke to Sarah, direct, honest, without the condescension some adults used with children. Thomas, however, remained unmoved, watching Jacob with narrowed eyes. Over the next days, a strange routine developed. Jacob remained too weak to do more than sit up for short periods, but his strength was slowly returning. Catherine continued to care for him, though she noticed he seemed uncomfortable with his helplessness. He was a man used to self-reliance, that much was clear. The children's reactions to his presence varied wildly. Sarah had adopted him immediately, sitting near him for hours, chattering about everything and nothing. Jacob listened with patient attention, occasionally asking questions that made Sarah light up with pleasure at being taken seriously. Emma was curious, but cautious. She'd bring him food, tend the fire near him, but Catherine noticed her daughter studying the stranger with thoughtful eyes. One evening, Emma appeared with Jacob's journal, the one Catherine had looked at briefly. "This is yours," Emma said, holding it out. "It fell out of your coat." "I didn't read it, but I saw some of the drawings. They're beautiful." Jacob took the journal with careful hands, and Catherine saw genuine emotion cross his face. "Thank you for keeping it safe." It's important to me." "The plants," Emma said shyly. "You know a lot about mountain plants. Are they all medicinal?" "Most of them," Jacob said. "The mountains provide if you know where to look. Food, medicine, materials. You just have to learn the language." Emma's eyes lit up. "Could you teach me?" "I mean, if you're here long enough. Mama knows some healing, but not plants like these." Jacob glanced at Catherine, asking permission without words. She nodded slightly, and he turned back to Emma. "I'd be honored. If your mother doesn't mind." That became their evening ritual. While Catherine prepared supper and Sarah played, Emma would sit with Jacob, and he'd show her pages from his journal, explaining each plant's properties, where it grew, how to prepare it. Catherine watched this developing connection with mixed feelings, gratitude that Emma was learning something valuable, but awareness that Emma was getting attached to someone who would inevitably leave. Thomas remained hostile. He'd help when his mother asked, but he never addressed Jacob directly if he could avoid it. One afternoon, Catherine was working in the barn when she heard raised voices from the cabin. She hurried inside to find Thomas standing over Jacob, fists clenched. "Don't need you here," Thomas was saying. "We were fine before you came. We'll be fine after you leave. Thomas." Catherine's voice was sharp, but Jacob held up a hand, his expression calm. "He's right, Mrs. Carter, you don't need me. You've been surviving just fine on your own." "We're not just surviving," Thomas spat. "This is our home, our family. You're just passing through." "I am," Jacob agreed quietly. "And I'm sorry if my presence here troubles you. That wasn't my intention." Something in his gentle acknowledgement seemed to deflate Thomas's anger. The boy stood there a moment longer, then turned and stalked out of the cabin, slamming the door behind him. Catherine started to apologize, but Jacob shook his head. "Don't, he's protecting you. His father would be proud." The words hit Catherine like a physical blow. She turned away, busying herself with unnecessary tasks, but Jacob had seen the tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to cause pain." "You didn't," Catherine managed. It's been 2 years, and sometimes it still feels like yesterday." Thomas took it hardest. "He thinks he has to be the man of the house now. Heavy burden for a boy that age." "Yes." Catherine turned back to face him. "Mr. Brennan, Jacob, I have to ask, what were you doing out in that storm? Mountain men know weather. You should have been holed up somewhere safe." Jacob was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant. "I was careless, distracted. Sometimes a man gets so caught up in his own thoughts that he stops paying attention to the world around him. That's dangerous in the mountains. What were you thinking about that was worth risking your life?" He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Catherine saw such depths of sorrow in those grey eyes that she almost regretted asking. "Ghosts, Mrs. Carter. I was thinking about ghosts." Before she could ask more, they heard a small sound. Sarah had been napping, but she'd woken and now stood in the doorway, watching them with sleepy eyes. Jacob's expression immediately shifted, the sorrow tucking itself away behind a gentle smile. "Hello, little one. Did we wake you?" Sarah shook her head and padded over to him. Without invitation, she climbed up to sit beside him, curling into his side as naturally as if she'd known him her whole life. Jacob stiffened for a moment, clearly uncomfortable, but Sarah simply settled against him with a contented sigh. "You're warm now," she announced. "When we found you, you were cold as ice. Now you're warm like a person should be." Jacob's hand, almost of its own accord, moved to rest lightly on Sarah's head. Catherine saw his throat work, saw him swallow hard. Whatever walls this man had built around himself, her youngest daughter had just walked right through them. That evening, as Catherine prepared supper, she noticed Jacob watching her family with an expression she couldn't quite read. The children moved around each other with practiced ease, Emma helping without being asked, Thomas setting the table with rough efficiency, Sarah chattering about something that had happened that day. It was the comfortable chaos of family, something so normal Catherine barely registered it anymore, but Jacob registered it. She could see it in his face, the way someone drowning might look at the shore, with longing and loss and something that might have been hope, if hope hadn't been too painful to allow. After the children were in bed, Catherine sat by the fire, mending one of Thomas's shirts. Jacob had improved enough to sit in the chair across from her, rather than lying by the fire. They'd fallen into a comfortable silence, the kind that didn't need filling. "Your children are remarkable," Jacob said suddenly. "You've raised them well. Strong and good. That's rare. They've had to grow up too fast," Catherine said, her needle moving steadily. "I wish I could give them an easier life. Easy doesn't build character." "Hard times," he paused. "Hard times make us who we are, for better or worse." Catherine set down her mending and looked at him directly. "You had a family. I heard you in your fever." "Margaret and James." Jacob's face went carefully blank. "That was a long time ago. But you still carry them with you." "I suppose I do." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "My wife and son died 20 years ago. House fire. I was away on a trapping expedition. I came back to nothing." "I'm sorry," Catherine said, and meant it. "That's a terrible burden to carry alone." "It was my fault," Jacob said flatly. "I chose the mountains over them. Chose proving myself over being home where I belonged. They paid for my selfishness with their lives. You couldn't have known, couldn't I?" His voice was suddenly sharp. "Margaret asked me not to go. Said she had a feeling, said she needed me home, but I went anyway, because I was stubborn and proud and thought I knew better. So yes, Mrs. Carter, I could have known. I should have known." Catherine looked at this man, bowed under 20 years of guilt, and saw something she recognized, the weight of wondering if you'd done enough, been enough, made the right choices. She carried her own version of that weight. Daniel died because of a faulty harness, she said quietly. He was moving cattle, and the harness broke on the pulley system. He fell 20 feet, broke his neck. I was the one who insisted we use that old equipment instead of buying new. We were saving money for, well, it doesn't matter what for now. The point is, I told him it would hold. I was wrong. Jacob met her eyes, and in that moment they understood each other completely. Two people carrying guilt that might or might not have been earned, but which they carried nonetheless. I'm sorry, he said simply. So am I. Catherine picked up her mending again. But I have 3 children who need me to be more than my guilt. Oh, I get up every day and I try to do better. That's all any of us can do. Jacob nodded slowly, something shifting in his expression. When he finally spoke again, his voice was rough with emotion he was trying to hide. That wooden horse. The one in my pack. I carved it for James. He never got to see it. I've carried it for 20 years, couldn't seem to let it go. Maybe you weren't meant to let it go, Catherine said gently. Maybe you were meant to carry it until you could give it to someone who needed it. Jacob looked at her sharply, understanding her meaning. After a long moment he nodded. Maybe so, Mrs. Carter, maybe so. That night, after Catherine had gone to bed, Jacob sat alone by the dying fire, the wooden horse in his hands. For 20 years, he'd carried his guilt and grief through mountains and valleys, punishing himself with isolation, telling himself he didn't deserve connection or joy or family. But now, in this small cabin with these people he'd known less than a week, something was shifting. The ice around his heart, frozen as solid as that compass he'd been clutching when they found him, was beginning, just barely, to thaw, and it terrified him, because if he let himself care again, he could lose again. And he didn't know if he'd survive that twice. By the end of the first week, Jacob could stand without assistance, though his legs still trembled with the effort. Catherine watched him pace the small confines of the cabin like a caged animal, restless and clearly uncomfortable with his continued dependence on her family's charity. I should be helping, he said, for the 3rd time that morning. There's work that needs doing. I can see it from the window, that fence line, the barn roof. You're still recovering, Catherine said firmly, though she knew he was right about the work. Another few days, and then we'll see. Another few days, and I'll go mad from sitting idle. But he lowered himself back into the chair by the fire, and Catherine noticed he moved more easily than yesterday. He was healing despite his impatience. Thomas came in from morning chores, his face red from cold and his expression dark. He barely glanced at Jacob, moving straight to warm himself by the fire. Jacob watched the boy with careful attention, and Catherine could see him measuring the distance Thomas maintained. How are the cattle? Catherine asked. Fine, Thomas said shortly. North fence is sagging more. Won't hold through another storm? I know. Catherine's voice was tight with frustration. We'll manage. When? Thomas demanded, his anger suddenly breaking through. When will we manage? Next week, next month, when we've lost half the herd because we don't have the lumber or the hands to fix what needs fixing. Thomas, Catherine warned, but he was already on his feet. I'm trying, Mama. I'm trying as hard as I can. But I'm not Papa. I can't do it all. The boy's voice broke on the last word, and Catherine's heart broke with it. She moved to comfort him. But Jacob spoke first, his voice quiet but carrying weight. No one expects you to be your father, son. That's not your burden to carry. Thomas rounded on him, eyes blazing. Don't call me son. You're not my father. You don't know anything about what I'm supposed to carry. You're right, Jacob said evenly. I'm not your father. I'm just someone who sees a boy trying to shoulder a man's load and breaking under it. I'm not breaking, Thomas said fiercely. Aren't you? Jacob's gaze was steady, not unkind, just honest. There's no shame in needing help, Thomas. The shame is in being too proud to accept it when it's offered. I don't need help from someone who's just going to leave anyway, Thomas shot back. But his anger was weakening. Catherine could hear it. Underneath was just fear and exhaustion, and the terrible weight of feeling inadequate. Jacob was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that surprised them all. Then I won't leave. Not yet. Not until that fence is fixed and the barn is sound and you and your mother have everything you need to make it through winter." Catherine started to protest. They couldn't ask that of him, couldn't obligate him, but Jacob held up a hand. "I'm offering, Mrs. Carter, not out of pity, but because I can help and you need help. Let me repay what you've given me. My life is worth at least a few weeks of labor, don't you think?" Thomas stared at Jacob, clearly torn between suspicion and desperate hope. Catherine understood that conflict. She felt it herself. They did need help, badly, but accepting help meant trusting someone, and trust was a currency they couldn't afford to spend lightly. "Why?" Thomas asked finally. "Why would you stay and help people you don't even know?" Jacob's expression was complicated. Pain and hope and something like hunger all mixed together. "Because 20 years ago, I should have stayed and helped the people I loved. And I didn't. Maybe this is my chance to do it right, even if it's too late for—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "Maybe I can at least do it right this time." Thomas stood there a moment longer, then gave a short, sharp nod and headed for the door. But before he left, he turned back. "The fence needs new posts, east side of the barn." "If you're serious." "I am," Jacob said. After Thomas left, Catherine found herself unable to look directly at Jacob. His offer was too generous, his reasons too raw and honest. She busied herself with breakfast preparations, but she could feel his eyes on her. "Mrs. Carter," he said finally, "I've overstepped. I should have asked you first, before making promises to your son." "You should have," she agreed, still not looking at him. But Thomas needed to hear it. "He's been carrying too much for too long. And you?" Jacob asked gently. "What have you been carrying?" Catherine's hands stilled on the bread she was slicing. When she finally turned to face him, she was startled by the understanding in his eyes. He saw her, not just the capable widow managing a homestead, but the woman underneath who was exhausted and afraid and barely holding everything together. "Everything," she said simply. "I've been carrying everything," Jacob nodded slowly. "Then let me help carry it. For a while at least." Catherine wanted to refuse. Pride demanded she refuse. But she was so tired, and her children needed more than she could give them alone, and this man was offering help without asking for anything in return. "At least nothing she could see yet, all right," she said finally. "Stay, help. But Jacob, when you're ready to leave, you leave. No obligations beyond what you've offered. I won't have you staying out of guilt or duty beyond what's fair." "Agreed," Jacob said. "Though I suspect we have different definitions of what's fair." The next morning, Jacob insisted on starting work despite Catherine's protests that he should rest another day. He moved carefully, clearly still recovering, but his hands were steady and his knowledge apparent. Thomas watched from a distance as Jacob assessed the fence line, examined the posts, and began planning repairs with the efficiency of someone who'd built and mended 100 fences before. "We'll need to replace 4 posts," Jacob told Thomas, who'd edged closer despite himself. "The rest we can shore up. You have lumber?" "Some," Thomas said grudgingly. "Not enough for everything that needs doing. Then we work with what we have and make do with the rest. That's the way of things out here." Jacob glanced at the boy. "You know which posts are weakest?" Thomas nodded and pointed them out, and Catherine watched from the cabin window as something shifted between them. Not trust yet, but maybe the beginning of respect. Jacob asked Thomas questions: where the lumber was stored, what tools they had, how Daniel had usually approached repairs, and he listened to the answers as if Thomas's opinions mattered. Emma appeared at Catherine's elbow, watching the same scene. "He's good with Thomas," she observed quietly. "He is," Catherine agreed. "Do you think he'll really stay?" Catherine heard the hope in her daughter's voice and felt a pang of worry. The children were getting attached, especially Emma and Sarah. Thomas was still guarded, but even he was softening. What would happen when Jacob eventually left, as he inevitably would? "I don't know, honey," Catherine said honestly, "but we shouldn't count on it. He's been alone a long time. That's not easy to change." Emma was quiet for a moment, then said, "He carved that horse for his son, the one who died. Did you know that?" "Yes, he told me. He showed it to me yesterday. Asked if I thought Sarah would like it." Emma glanced at her mother. I think he wants to give it to her, but he's scared to. Catherine's chest tightened. Why do you think that? Because giving it away means letting go, and he's not sure he knows how. Emma spoke with a wisdom beyond her 12 years. But maybe he needs to. Maybe we all need to let go of some things so we can hold on to new ones, out of the mouths of babes, Catherine thought. Or in this case, daughters who'd learned too much about loss too young. That evening, after supper, Jacob pulled the wooden horse from his pack. Catherine watched as he turned it over in his scarred hands, his expression distant. Sarah was playing nearby with her rag doll, singing softly to herself. "Sarah," Jacob called gently. The little girl looked up, her face brightening. Come here a moment. I have something for you." Sarah bounded over with her usual enthusiasm. Jacob held out the horse, and Catherine could see his hand trembling slightly. "I made this a long time ago," he said, "for someone who couldn't have it. But I think you should have it now, if you'd like it." Sarah took the horse with reverent hands, her eyes wide. She examined every detail, the flowing mane, the powerful legs, the careful craftsmanship that had gone into creating something so small and perfect. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "Did you really make this?" "I did." "All by yourself?" "All by myself." Jacob's voice was rough. "Do you like it?" Instead of answering, Sarah threw her arms around his neck in an enthusiastic hug. Jacob froze for a moment, clearly unprepared for such an open display of affection. Then slowly, carefully, his arms came up to hug her back. Over Sarah's head his eyes met Catherine's, and she saw tears there that he was fighting to contain. "Thank you," Sarah said, pulling back to look at the horse again. "I'm going to call him Thunder, because he looks fast like thunder sounds." Jacob laughed, an actual laugh, rusty from disuse but genuine. "Thunder, that's a fine name." Sarah settled herself against his side, exactly as she'd done before, but this time Jacob didn't stiffen. He just let her be there, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder while she examined her new treasure. Catherine felt something shift in her chest, not quite trust, not quite affection, but something that might become both given time. This man who'd lived alone for 20 years, who'd punished himself with isolation and grief, was beginning to remember how to be human, how to be part of something larger than his own pain. Thomas came in from one last check on the livestock, and stopped short when he saw Sarah curled up against Jacob. For a moment, his face was a storm of conflicting emotions. Then Emma caught his eye and gave him a look that clearly said, "Let it be." Thomas's jaw worked, but he said nothing. Just hung up his coat and moved to the fire to warm his hands. But Catherine noticed he didn't immediately leave the room, didn't retreat to the bedroom as he usually did. He stayed, listening to Sarah chatter about Thunder the horse and all the adventures they would have together. Late that night, after everyone else had gone to bed, Catherine found Jacob standing at the window, looking out at the moonlit snow. She should have been asleep herself, but rest was elusive these days. "Can't sleep?" she asked quietly. He shook his head. "Too used to being outside. Walls feel strange." She came to stand beside him. "You've been alone a long time. 20 years, give or take. That's a long time to punish yourself." Jacob glanced at her sharply. "Is that what you think I was doing?" "Isn't it?" Catherine met his gaze steadily. "Hiding in the mountains, avoiding people, carrying your guilt like a badge of honor. That's not living, Jacob. That's just a slower way of dying." He flinched as if she'd struck him, but didn't look away. "Maybe so, but it was what I deserved." "Who decides what we deserve?" Catherine asked. "You, God. Because I have 3 children who didn't deserve to lose their father, and I didn't deserve to lose my husband, and you didn't deserve to lose your family. But we did, all of us. So now what? Do we spend the rest of our lives punishing ourselves for surviving? Or do we try to build something new with what we have left?" Jacob was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm afraid." "Of what?" "Of caring again. Of letting people in. Of having something to lose." He turned to face her fully. "Your daughter gave me a hug tonight, and for 1 second I felt like maybe I could have this. A family, connection, and then I remembered what happened the last time I had those things, and I wanted to run." Right out that door and back to the mountains where it's safe. Safe, Catherine repeated. Is that really what you call it? Safe? At least there, the only person I can hurt is myself. Catherine reached out and took his hand, his scarred, work-roughened hand, in hers. The touch was bold, perhaps too bold, but it felt necessary. Listen to me, Jacob Brennan. Life doesn't come with guarantees. I could lose everything tomorrow. You could lose everything tomorrow. But hiding from connection doesn't protect us from pain. It just guarantees we'll live in it. I don't know how to do this, Jacob admitted. How to be part of something again. It's been too long. Then learn, Catherine said simply. We'll all learn together. You're not the only one who's forgotten how to trust, how to hope. But we can remember, if we're brave enough to try. Jacob looked down at their joined hands, then back up at her face. In the moonlight, he looked both ancient and young, worn down and somehow hopeful. All right, he said finally. I'll try. God help me, I'll try. Catherine squeezed his hand once, then released it and stepped back. But something had been acknowledged between them, something neither was quite ready to name, but both felt stirring in the space where grief had lived so long. She turned to go back to bed, then paused. Jacob, thank you for the fence work today, and for being patient with Thomas. He needs a man's guidance, even if he's too stubborn to admit it. He's a good boy, Jacob said. Strong, brave. His father would be proud. Yes, Catherine agreed softly, touching the ring on her finger. Yes, he would be. That night, in her cold bed alone, Catherine lay awake thinking about the stranger who was becoming less strange with each passing day. She thought about Daniel, about loyalty and love, and whether it was possible to honor the dead while still living for the future. She thought about her children, about the way Sarah had curled up against Jacob so naturally, the way Emma hung on his every word when he talked about plants and mountains, the way even Thomas was beginning to soften around the edges. And she thought about Daniel's rifle, still hanging above the mantel where she'd left it 2 years ago, untouched and gathering dust, a monument to grief, a symbol of everything frozen in place. Maybe, she thought as sleep finally claimed her, maybe it was time for some things to thaw. Maybe winter couldn't last forever, even in the heart. Maybe spring would come eventually, if they were patient and brave enough to wait for it. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. Inside the Carter cabin, 5 people slept. 4 who'd been a broken family learning to heal, and 1 who'd forgotten what family meant but was beginning to remember. The fence would be fixed. The barn would be mended. And somehow, almost without any of them noticing it happening, something else was being mended too. Something harder to name, but perhaps more important than any building or fence line. Something that felt dangerously like hope. The second week brought a rhythm to their days that felt almost natural. Jacob rose with the sun, despite Catherine's continued insistence that he should rest more. He worked alongside Thomas on the fence repairs, and Catherine noticed how the boy no longer maintained such rigid distance. They didn't talk much, both were men of few words, but there was an easy understanding developing between them. Jacob's competence showed in everything he touched. The fence posts went in straight and deep, properly braced. He repaired the barn roof with efficiency that spoke of long experience, showing Thomas techniques Daniel had never known. He handled the livestock with calm authority, and even the most skittish horse seemed to settle under his hands. He knows what he's doing, Emma observed one afternoon, watching Jacob work with Thomas to construct a new feed trough. Everything Papa did, Jacob knows how to do it. Sometimes better. Catherine heard the complicated note in her daughter's voice, admiration mixed with something like guilt. Your father was a fine man and a good rancher, she said gently. Jacob's just had more years to learn, and different experiences. I know. Emma was quiet for a moment. Mama, is it wrong that I like having him here? It feels like maybe we can actually manage now. Like we're not just barely surviving anymore. Catherine pulled her daughter close. It's not wrong, honey. It's natural. We needed help, and he's providing it. There's no shame in that. But even as she said it, Catherine felt her own complicated tangle of emotions. Relief at having capable hands to share the work. Gratitude for his patience with her children. And underneath it all, something else. an awareness of Jacob as a man, not just as help. The way he moved, economical and sure. The rare smile that transformed his weathered face. The gentle way he spoke to her children, as if they were people worth listening to. She was noticing him, and that felt like a betrayal of Daniel's memory. The evenings had become Catherine's favorite time. After supper, they'd gather by the fire, the children with their various activities, Jacob often working on small repairs or whittling, Catherine mending or preparing food for the next day. And they'd talk about everything and nothing. Jacob told stories of the mountains, carefully edited for young ears. He talked about tracking animals, reading weather signs, surviving in conditions that would kill most men. Thomas listened with rapt attention, absorbing every word. Emma asked endless questions about plants and healing, and Sarah would climb into his lap as naturally as breathing, playing with Thunder the wooden horse, while Jacob's large hands rested carefully on her small shoulders. One evening, Thomas surprised them all by asking, "How did you learn all this? The tracking, the survival skills, everything?" Jacob was quiet for a moment, his knife pausing in its work on the piece of wood he was shaping. "I had a good teacher when I was young. A man named Thomas Running Bear. He was half Shoshone, half French trapper. Took me under his wing when I was about your age, taught me everything he knew about living in harmony with the land instead of fighting it." "What happened to him?" Emma asked. "He got old, like we all do eventually. Passed in his sleep one winter up in the Tetons. Peaceful end for a hard life." Jacob's expression was distant. "He was a good man. Left me his trapping territory and that journal you've been reading. The one with all the plant drawings?" Emma's eyes widened. "He drew those?" "Most of them. I've added over the years, but the foundation, all that knowledge about medicine and food, that was Thomas." Jacob smiled faintly. "He used to say the mountains would provide for you if you learned their language. I spent 20 years learning to speak it fluently, and now you're teaching me," Emma said softly. "Yes," Jacob agreed. "Knowledge isn't meant to be hoarded. It's meant to be passed on." Catherine watched this exchange and felt something settle in her chest. This was good. Her children learning from someone with deep knowledge, gaining skills that would serve them their whole lives. Even Thomas, who'd been so resistant, was opening up, asking questions, engaging. Later that night, after the children were asleep, Catherine found Jacob examining their supply stores in the root cellar. He had a thoughtful expression, and she knew he'd realized what she'd been trying to hide. They were running dangerously low. "It's worse than I thought," he said without preamble. "You've got maybe 6 weeks of food here if you're careful. And we're heading into the hard part of winter." "I know." Catherine kept her voice steady. "I've been rationing. We'll make it stretch." "Not enough." Jacob turned to face her. "Mrs. Carter, Catherine, you need supplies?" "Real supplies. From town. Town is 2 days' ride. I can't leave the children that long, and I can't take them in this weather." "No," Jacob agreed. "But I can go." Catherine shook her head immediately. "You've done enough. I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking. I'm offering." His grey eyes were steady on hers. "I've got money saved from years of trapping. No use to me up in the mountains. Let me use it for something that matters." "Jacob, no. That's your money. You earned it, and I'll earn it again next season. Meanwhile, your children need food, medicine, supplies to get through winter." He moved closer, his voice dropping. "Pride is a luxury you can't afford right now, Catherine. Let me help." She wanted to refuse, wanted to maintain her independence, her dignity. But he was right. Pride was a luxury, and her children's welfare came first. She closed her eyes and nodded. "All right. But we'll pay you back, somehow, when we can." "If it makes you feel better to think so," Jacob said, but there was warmth in his voice. "I'll take Thomas with me. He should learn the route, and he's old enough to make the journey." Catherine's first instinct was to refuse. Thomas was still just a boy, but she bit back the words. Jacob was right. Thomas needed this, needed to feel trusted with adult responsibilities. And Jacob would keep him safe. "When will you leave?" "Tomorrow, if the weather holds. We'll be back in 4 days. 5 at most." That night Catherine lay awake worrying about sending Thomas out into the winter with a man they'd known less than 2 weeks. About what might happen while they were gone. About how much she'd come to rely on Jacob's presence in such a short time. But underneath the worry was something else. Trust. She trusted him to keep Thomas safe, trusted him to come back. And that realization was both comforting and terrifying. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Jacob and Thomas prepared for the journey with careful efficiency. Catherine packed what food she could spare, checked their supplies twice, and tried not to let her anxiety show. Emma hugged Thomas tightly. "Be safe. Come back soon." "I will." Thomas tried to sound casual, but Catherine could see the excitement in his eyes. This was an adventure, a chance to prove himself. Sarah gave Thomas Thunder the horse. "For luck," she said solemnly. "He'll keep you safe." Thomas took the wooden horse with surprising gentleness. "I'll bring him back to you. Promise." Then it was Catherine's turn. She pulled Thomas into a fierce hug, breathing in the little boy's smell of him that was already fading into something more grown up. "Listen to Jacob," she said quietly. "Learn from him. And Thomas, your father would be so proud of the man you're becoming." Thomas's eyes shone suspiciously bright. "I love you, Mama. I love you too, sweetheart. More than you'll ever know." She turned to Jacob, who was checking the saddle straps one final time. For a moment, they just looked at each other, and Catherine was struck by how much had changed in 2 weeks. This man who'd been a stranger was now, what? Friend felt insufficient. Something more, something she wasn't ready to name. "Keep him safe," she said simply. "With my life," Jacob replied. And she believed him absolutely. They mounted up and rode out, Thomas sitting straighter than Catherine had seen him sit in 2 years. She watched until they disappeared over the rise, Emma and Sarah on either side of her. "They'll be all right," Emma said, as much to convince herself as her mother. "Yes," Catherine agreed. "They will be." But the cabin felt emptier without them, quieter in ways that had nothing to do with sound. Sarah moped around the first day, missing her brother and her new friend. Emma threw herself into chores with determined energy. And Catherine tried not to count the hours until they'd return. That evening, sitting by the fire with just her daughters, Catherine found herself staring at the empty chair where Jacob had been sitting each night. When had it become his chair? When had this routine become so established that its disruption felt wrong? "Mama?" Sarah climbed into her lap. "Is Jacob going to stay forever?" Out of the mouths of babes again. Catherine stroked her daughter's hair and tried to find an honest answer. "I don't know, sweetheart. He's helped us so much already. But he has his own life, his own path. We can't expect him to give that up for us. But what if we asked him to stay?" Sarah persisted. "What if we told him we wanted him to be part of our family?" "Sarah," Emma said gently, "it's not that simple." "Why not?" Sarah looked between her mother and sister. "We like him. He likes us. Why can't he just stay and be with us always?" Catherine felt tears prick her eyes. Such simple logic from a child's perspective. Why couldn't it be that simple? "Because people are complicated," she said finally. "Jacob has his own hurts, his own reasons for living the way he does. We can't ask him to change his whole life for us." "But maybe he wants to change," Sarah said stubbornly. "Maybe he's just waiting for someone to ask." After Sarah was asleep, Emma helped her mother prepare for bed. They moved around each other in comfortable silence until Emma finally spoke. "Sarah's not entirely wrong, you know." Catherine paused in her movements. "What do you mean?" "About Jacob. I see the way he looks at us." "At you?" Emma's young face was far too knowing. "Like he wants to stay but doesn't know how, or doesn't think he deserves to." "Emma, I know it's complicated, Mama. I know you love Papa and we all miss him. But Papa's gone. And Jacob's here. And maybe that's not an accident. Maybe that's something like Providence." Catherine sat down heavily. When had her 12-year-old daughter become so wise? "I don't know if I'm ready for that," she admitted. "To think about moving forward. It feels like I'd be betraying your father's memory." "Or honoring it," Emma suggested quietly. "By choosing to live instead of just survive. By giving Thomas and Sarah a father again. By letting yourself be happy." Catherine pulled her daughter close. "When did you grow up so fast?" "Someone had to," Emma said with a small smile. "You and Thomas were too busy trying to hold everything together." Over the next 2 days, Catherine found herself thinking constantly about what Emma had said. About survival versus living. About honoring the dead versus embracing the future. about the difference between betrayal and growth. She found herself touching her wedding ring less, looking at Daniel's rifle above the mantel with new eyes, wondering what he would want for her, for their children. Would he want them frozen in grief, or would he want them to heal, to find joy again? On the third day, she took down the rifle, cleaned it properly for the first time in 2 years, oiled the stock, checked the mechanism. It was a fine weapon, well made, carefully maintained by Daniel. Thomas should have it, not as a monument to loss, but as a tool, as something useful passed from father to son. When Jacob and Thomas returned on the 4th day, riding into the yard laden with supplies, Catherine ran out to meet them. She pulled Thomas down from his horse and hugged him fiercely, then stepped back to see him properly. He looked different, older somehow, more confident. He was grinning, actually grinning, in a way she hadn't seen since before Daniel died. Mama, you should have seen it. The town, the people, everything. And Jacob taught me how to read trail signs and how to make camp, and the words tumbled out in an excited rush. Catherine looked over Thomas's head to Jacob, who was dismounting with easy grace. Their eyes met, and she saw something in his expression, warmth, affection, something that might have been hope. "Thank you," she said simply, "for bringing him back safe." "It was my privilege," Jacob replied. "He's a good traveling companion, smart and steady." Thomas beamed at the praise, and Catherine's heart swelled. When was the last time someone had told her son he was smart and steady? When was the last time Thomas had looked this happy? They unloaded the supplies, more than Catherine had expected. Flour, salt, dried beans, coffee, sugar, fabric, medicine. Luxuries they hadn't had in months. Jacob had been generous beyond reason. That evening, the family felt complete again. They sat around the fire, Thomas regaling them with stories from the journey. Jacob added occasional details, and Catherine noticed how easily they'd fallen into a pattern, like a team that had been working together for years rather than days. Sarah had reclaimed Thunder the horse and was content. Emma asked Jacob detailed questions about the plants he'd seen on the journey. And Thomas sat close to Jacob, unconscious mimicry in the way he held himself, the way he gestured. Finding a model, Catherine realized. Finding someone to pattern himself after. Later, after the children were in bed, Jacob helped Catherine store the supplies properly. They worked in comfortable silence until Catherine finally spoke. "You spent too much, more than we agreed on." "I spent what was needed." Jacob didn't look at her. "Your children deserve more than bare survival, Jacob." He turned to face her then, and the intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "I've lived 20 years with nothing and no one. I've saved every penny I earned because I had nothing worth spending it on. Let me spend it now on something that matters, on people who matter." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning neither was quite ready to acknowledge. "We matter to you," Catherine said softly. It wasn't a question. Yes, simple, honest, terrifying. "You matter to me." Catherine felt tears threaten. "You matter to us too, all of us. But especially, she couldn't finish. Couldn't say what she was feeling, because naming it made it real. And real meant vulnerable. And vulnerable meant she could lose again. But Jacob stepped closer, and his scarred hand came up to gently cup her cheek. The touch was tentative, asking permission, and Catherine found herself leaning into it. "I'm afraid," she whispered. "So am I," Jacob admitted, terrified. "But Catherine, I haven't felt alive in 20 years. These past 2 weeks with you and your children, I've remembered what it means to have something worth waking up for. Something worth staying for." "Are you?" she asked, hardly daring to hope. "Staying?" Jacob's thumb traced along her cheekbone, gentle despite the roughness of his hands. "If you'll have me, if you'll let me try to be what you and the children need. I can't promise I'll get it right. I'm out of practice at being human, but I'll try. God help me. I want to try." Catherine closed her eyes, leaning into his touch, letting herself have this moment of connection and possibility. Tomorrow she'd think about the complications. Tonight, she'd just feel grateful that sometimes, out of terrible storms and desperate circumstances, something good could grow. "Stay," she said simply. "Please stay." And in the quiet of the root cellar, surrounded by the supplies that would keep them through winter. Jacob Brennan and Catherine Carter acknowledged what had been building between them, fragile and new, but real as the second chances they'd both stopped believing in. Late winter came with a brief thaw, melting the top layer of snow into a muddy mess before freezing again into treacherous ice. Jacob had been with the Carter family for 6 weeks now, and the homestead showed the evidence of his capable hands everywhere. The barn roof no longer leaked. The fences stood straight and strong. The livestock were healthy and well-tended, but more than the physical improvements, the family itself had changed. Laughter came more easily now. The children moved with less burden on their young shoulders. And Catherine had started to smile again in ways that reached her eyes. They'd fallen into patterns that felt like permanence, even though no one had explicitly discussed the future. Jacob rose with the sun and worked alongside Thomas until dark. Emma spent her afternoons learning from Jacob's journal, her own notebook filling with careful observations about medicinal plants. Sarah followed Jacob everywhere, chattering constantly, secure in the knowledge that he'd listen, and in the evenings, after the children were asleep, Jacob and Catherine would sit by the fire, talking quietly about everything and nothing, their chairs gradually moving closer together as the weeks passed. It was the closest thing to happiness Jacob had felt in 20 years, and it terrified him because he still hadn't told her about the land. The moment of reckoning came on a grey afternoon when Catherine sat at the table with papers spread before her, worry creasing her forehead. Jacob recognized those papers. Legal documents, land deeds, the complicated paperwork that came with trying to hold on to a homestead. "What's wrong?" he asked, coming in from the barn. Catherine looked up, and he saw exhaustion in her eyes. "Nothing I haven't known about for months. I've been avoiding thinking about it, but I can't anymore. Tell me." She gestured at the papers with a helpless movement. Daniel had been negotiating for additional land. The Northern Valley. It's good grazing land, access to water, everything we'd need to expand the herd and make this place truly viable. He'd saved for years, but we were still short of the asking price when he died. Jacob's stomach dropped. He knew what was coming. "The owner is a man named Thomas Running Bear," Catherine continued. "Or was. He died years ago, and the land passed to someone else. Daniel had been trying to track down the new owner to make an offer, but he never found him. Then Daniel died, and I let it go. Couldn't afford it anyway." She looked at Jacob, defeat in her expression. "But now I've received a letter from a lawyer in Cheyenne. Apparently, they've finally located the current owner and are reaching out to all interested parties about purchasing the land. The asking price has gone up. It's more than I could ever hope to afford, even if I sold everything we have." "Let me see the letter," Jacob said quietly. Catherine handed it over, and Jacob read words he already knew were coming. The lawyer was reaching out on behalf of land surveys, trying to establish current ownership and assess market value for potential sale. The deed holder of record was listed as J. Brennan, last known address the Montana Territory Mountains. His secret, laid out in black and white on official paper. Catherine was still talking. "It's like a cruel joke, you know. The one thing we needed. The one thing that would make this homestead sustainable for the future, and it belongs to someone who doesn't even use it. Just sitting there wasted while we struggle to—" She stopped, noticing his expression. "Jacob, what's wrong?" He held up the letter, his hand not quite steady. "J. Brennan, that's me, Catherine. I'm the owner of the Northern Valley." The silence that followed was deafening. Catherine stared at him, her face going through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, understanding, and finally something that looked like betrayal. "You," she said flatly. "You own the land Daniel wanted." "The land we needed." "Yes. How long have you known?" This was the moment Jacob had been dreading. "I inherited it from Thomas Running Bear 20 years ago. I've never seen it, never developed it, barely remembered I owned it. But I realized it was the same land Daniel wanted about 3 weeks ago. Thomas mentioned it on our trip to town." 3 weeks. Catherine's voice was dangerously quiet. "You've known for 3 weeks that you owned what we desperately need, and you said nothing." "Catherine, I didn't know what to say." "I didn't want you to think—" "What?" She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. What didn't you want me to think, Jacob? That you were manipulating us, using our need against us? That all of this, she gestured between them, was just you positioning yourself to what? Get a wife, a ready-made family, a homestead someone else built? No! Jacob stood too, his voice rising. That's not... Catherine, I swear to you, I never meant... But you didn't tell me. Her voice broke on the words. You sat here night after night, watching me worry about our future, and you said nothing. You let me trust you, let my children trust you. And all the while you were keeping this secret. I was trying to find the right way to tell you. I knew how it would look. I knew you'd think what? The truth? Catherine's eyes were bright with unshed tears. That you had a solution to our problems all along, and chose not to share it. Why, Jacob? If you cared about us the way you claimed, why wouldn't you tell us? Because I wanted you to choose me for me. The words exploded out of him. Not because of what I could give you, not because I owned land you needed. I wanted you to want me just for who I am, not for what I have. Catherine laughed, a bitter sound. And you thought lying by omission was the way to earn my trust. You thought keeping secrets was how to build something real? I wasn't lying. You were, she said quietly, and somehow that was worse than if she'd shouted. Maybe not with words, but with silence. Every day you didn't tell me was a choice, Jacob, a choice to deceive me. Jacob felt his world crumbling around him. Everything he'd feared was coming true, and he had no one to blame but himself. Catherine, please, let me explain. Explain what? That you've been playing some kind of game with us, seeing if we'd accept you without the land, so you could feel good about yourself when you finally revealed you had the answer all along. It wasn't like that. Then what was it like? She wrapped her arms around herself. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you inserted yourself into our lives, made yourself necessary, made us care about you, all while holding the one card that could have solved our problems from the start. I was scared, Jacob said desperately. I was scared that if I told you too soon, everything would change, that you'd see me differently, that the children would what? Be grateful? Catherine's voice was sharp. Is that what you were afraid of, Jacob? That we'd be too grateful? That we'd want you for what you could give us instead of who you are? Well, now you'll never know, will you? Because you made that choice for us. You decided we couldn't be trusted with the truth. The children had heard the raised voices. Emma appeared in the doorway of the bedroom, her face pale. Mama, what's happening? Catherine took a shaking breath, visibly trying to compose herself. Nothing, honey. Go back to bed, but you're fighting. You and Jacob are fighting. It's all right, Catherine said, but her voice betrayed her. We're discussing something. Thomas appeared behind Emma, and then Sarah, rubbing sleep from her eyes. They all stood there, looking between their mother and Jacob with confused, worried faces. Jacob felt like he was watching his worst nightmare unfold. These children who'd begun to trust him, to accept him, were now seeing him through their mother's eyes, as someone who'd deceived them, who'd kept secrets, who couldn't be trusted. Jacob. Sarah's small voice cut through the tension. Why is Mama upset? He couldn't answer. Couldn't find words that would make sense to a 6-year-old. How did you explain that good intentions paved the road to hell? That fear could make you do stupid things? That sometimes trying to protect people from one kind of hurt just caused a different kind? Catherine found her voice. Children, go back to bed. We'll talk about this in the morning. But Thomas started. Now, Catherine said firmly, and her tone brooked no argument. The children retreated reluctantly, and Jacob could see the worry in their faces, the confusion. Emma looked back once, her expression suggesting she'd heard more than Catherine realized and was already putting pieces together. When they were alone again, Catherine turned back to Jacob, and the hurt in her eyes nearly broke him. I need you to leave, she said quietly. Catherine, not forever. Just tonight. I need space to think, to figure out what this means. Please let me explain properly. Let me tell you why I waited, what I was planning. You had weeks to explain, Jacob, weeks to tell me the truth. Why should I listen now? Because I love you, he said desperately. It was the first time he'd said the words, and they came out raw and unpolished, stripped of any eloquence. I love you and I love your children, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I waited. I was wrong. I was a coward. But please don't send me away without letting me try to make this right." Catherine closed her eyes, tears finally spilling over. "Love isn't enough, Jacob, not without trust. Not without honesty. I know that, and I broke your trust. But Catherine, I'm asking you to give me a chance to earn it back." She was quiet for a long time, and Jacob could see the war raging behind her eyes. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "The barn. You can sleep in the barn tonight. Tomorrow we'll talk. But right now I can't look at you without feeling like I don't know you at all." It was better than being sent away completely, but it still felt like a knife to the chest. Jacob nodded, unable to trust his voice. He gathered his coat and bedroll, pausing at the door. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I was planning to give you the land. All of it. No strings, no conditions. I was just trying to find the right way to do it. The right time. But I waited too long, and now I've ruined everything." Catherine didn't respond, just stood with her arms wrapped around herself, staring at the fire. Jacob went out into the cold night, and the barn had never felt more empty or lonely. He made a bed in the hay, but sleep was impossible. He lay there in the darkness, replaying every conversation, every moment he could have told her, and didn't. She was right. He'd been a coward. Had let fear dictate his actions, just like he had 20 years ago with Margaret. He'd chosen wrong again, and once again, the people he loved were paying the price. Inside the cabin, Catherine sat by the dying fire, the legal papers still scattered on the table. She picked up the letter again, read through it with new eyes. J. Brennan, the same man who'd carved a wooden horse for her daughter, the same man who'd taught her son to track and hunt, the same man who'd held her face in his scarred hands and told her she mattered, the same man who'd kept a secret that could have changed everything. She touched her wedding ring. That old habit of seeking comfort in the familiar. Daniel had never lied to her, had been honest to a fault, sometimes brutally so. It was one of the things she'd loved about him, his straightforward nature, his inability to dissemble. Jacob was more complicated, more damaged, and apparently more capable of deception, even if he'd convinced himself it was for the right reasons. Emma appeared silently at her side. "Mama, I couldn't sleep." Catherine pulled her daughter close. "Me neither, sweetheart. Is Jacob leaving?" "I don't know. Do you want him to leave?" That was the question, wasn't it? Catherine searched her heart for the answer. She was hurt, angry, felt betrayed. But underneath all that, did she want him gone? "No," she admitted quietly. "Even now, even angry as I am, I don't want him to leave." "Then tell him that," Emma said with the simple logic of youth. "Tell him you're angry, but you want to work it out. Isn't that what you taught us? That family means forgiving each other?" "He's not family, Emma, isn't he?" Emma looked at her mother with two wise eyes. "He feels like family to me. To all of us." Catherine held her daughter close and tried not to think about the man sleeping in the barn, alone with his regrets. Tried not to think about how empty the cabin felt without him. Tried not to acknowledge that somewhere in the last 6 weeks, Jacob Brennan had become essential to their lives in ways that had nothing to do with land or money or practical help. He'd become home, and she didn't know if she could forgive him for making her care this much and then betraying her trust. But she also didn't know if she could send him away. Outside, the wind picked up, howling around the corners of the buildings. In the barn, Jacob lay awake, listening to it and wondering if he'd just destroyed his last chance at redemption. In the cabin, Catherine sat by the fire, trying to decide if trust once broken could ever be fully repaired. And somewhere between the two buildings, in the cold Wyoming night, hung the question neither of them could answer yet. Was love enough to bridge the gap between intention and action, between wanting to do right and actually doing it? Morning would bring answers. But tonight, there was only the hurt, the anger, the regret, and the stubborn, painful truth that even broken, they were bound to each other in ways neither had expected or entirely wanted. The land deed lay on the table, evidence of a secret revealed. But the real revelation was simpler and more profound. Loving someone meant being vulnerable to them, And vulnerability always came with the risk of pain. Jacob had tried to protect himself from that pain by waiting to reveal the truth. In doing so, he'd caused the very hurt he'd tried to avoid. And now, all either of them could do was wait for morning and hope that dawn would bring clarity, if not absolution. Dawn came grey and cold, the kind of morning that matched Jacob's mood perfectly. He'd barely slept, spending the night replaying every moment, every conversation, trying to pinpoint the exact instant he should have told Catherine the truth. There were dozens of opportunities, hundreds maybe, and he'd let every single one pass by. He rose stiff and cold, tended to the animals with mechanical efficiency, and tried to prepare himself for whatever conversation awaited him. Through the barn window, he could see smoke rising from the cabin chimney. The family was awake. Inside, Catherine had been up even earlier, moving through the morning routine with Emma's quiet help. Thomas had sensed something was wrong and was being unusually subdued. Sarah kept asking where Jacob was, why he hadn't come for breakfast. Catherine, Jacob's voice was rough with emotion. I never wanted it. Running Bear left it to me when I was drowning in grief, and I never thought about it because I didn't care about anything. I was barely alive myself. If I'd known, if I'd had any idea that someone needed it, that a family was struggling while I let it sit empty. But you did know, Catherine interrupted. Maybe not at first. But for 3 weeks you knew we needed it, and you said nothing. I was wrong, Jacob said simply. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. I can't undo it. I can only tell you that my reasons, however flawed, came from wanting to do right by you, not from malice. Not from manipulation, just from fear and stupidity and not knowing how to navigate something I haven't had to navigate in 20 years. Sarah, who'd been quiet through all of this, suddenly spoke up. Are you leaving, Papa Jacob? The use of the name, the one she'd given him weeks ago, nearly broke Jacob. He looked at the little girl, saw the worry in her face, and felt the full weight of what his deception had cost. That's up to your mother, he said quietly. All eyes turned to Catherine. She stood there, this strong woman who'd carried her family through grief and hardship, and Jacob could see the war raging inside her. Hurt versus love, anger versus need, pride versus pragmatism. I don't know, she said finally. I don't know what the right thing is here, Mama, Emma said gently. What do you want? Not what's right or proper, or what you think you should want. What do you actually want? Catherine looked at her daughter, then at Jacob, and her face crumpled slightly. I want to trust him. I want to believe that what we had these past weeks was real. But I'm scared. I'm scared that I don't really know him. That I've been seeing what I wanted to see instead of what's actually there. Jacob stood slowly, carefully, as if approaching a wounded animal. Catherine, I'm going to tell you everything now. Everything I should have told you weeks ago. And then you can decide. He took a breath and began. My name is Jacob Brennan. I'm 52 years old. 22 years ago, I married a woman named Margaret. We had a son, James. I was a trapper, away from home more than I was there, always chasing the next season, the next fortune. Margaret begged me to stay home that last winter. Said she had a bad feeling, but I was stubborn and proud and thought I knew better. While I was gone, there was a fire. They both died. The children were silent, listening to a story they'd only heard pieces of before. I've spent 20 years punishing myself for that, living alone in the mountains, avoiding people, telling myself I didn't deserve connection or happiness or family. Thomas Running Bear left me his knowledge and his land when he died, and I barely noticed because I didn't care about anything. I was just existing, going through the motions. Jacob's voice grew thick, but he pushed on. And then your children found me dying in the snow, and they saved me, not just from freezing to death, but from that empty half-life I'd been living. These past 6 weeks they've been a gift, a second chance I didn't think I deserved. But I was so scared of losing it that I made bad choices. I kept secrets because I was terrified that if you knew the truth, you'd see me differently. You'd want me for what I could give you instead of who I am. He moved closer to Catherine, though he didn't touch her. I'm not a good man, Catherine. I'm broken and scarred, and I've made terrible mistakes. But I love you. I love your children. And I want to spend whatever time I have left trying to be worthy of you. Not perfect. I'll never be perfect. But present, honest, trying. Catherine's tears were flowing freely now. I want to believe you. Then believe me, please. Jacob's own eyes were wet. I'll sign over the land tomorrow. Today, right now if you want. No conditions. It's yours, whether you want me or not. Because you need it, and I have it, and that's reason enough. It's not about the land, Catherine said, her voice breaking. It was never just about the land, Jacob. It's about trust. About knowing that when things get hard, when decisions have to be made, you'll be honest with me. That you'll trust me enough to include me. I will, Jacob said. I promise you, Catherine. No more secrets. No more waiting for the right time. Just honesty, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Thomas spoke up then, his voice steady beyond his years. Mama, I've watched Jacob for weeks now. Watched how he works, how he treats us, how he talks to you when he thinks no one's listening. He's not Papa, he'll never be Papa, but he's a good man. A man who made a mistake. We all make mistakes. Your son is wise, Jacob said softly. Wiser than me. Catherine looked around at her children, at Emma nodding in agreement, at Sarah with tears streaming down her face, at Thomas standing straight and sure. They wanted this, wanted Jacob to stay, wanted to forgive him and move forward, but could she? She closed her eyes and thought about Daniel. What would he want for her? For his children? She thought she knew. Daniel had been a practical man, but he'd also been a loving one. He'd want them to have help, to have security, to have someone who cared for them. And he'd want Catherine to live, not just survive. I'm still hurt, she said finally, opening her eyes. I'm still angry. And I'm going to need time to trust you again fully. Jacob nodded, hope and fear warring on his face. I understand. But Catherine continued, I don't want you to leave. I want you to stay. I want us to work through this. Because Emma's right, you do feel like family. And family means forgiving each other. It means working through the hard things together. The relief on Jacob's face was palpable. Thank you. Thank you, Catherine. Don't thank me yet, she said, but there was the hint of a smile beneath the seriousness. You're going to have to earn back my trust. That's going to take work. I'll do whatever it takes. Sarah jumped up from her chair and ran to Jacob, throwing her arms around his waist. You're staying. You're really staying. Jacob lifted her up, holding her close, his face buried in her hair. Emma came next, more reserved but no less genuine in her embrace. And then Thomas, who stuck out his hand man to man, before Jacob pulled him into a hug as well. Over the children's heads, Jacob's eyes met Catherine's. There was still hurt there, still anger, but also something else, determination, hope, the beginnings of forgiveness. That afternoon, Jacob retrieved the land deed from his belongings. The whole family gathered around the table as he spread it out, explaining what it represented. The Northern Valley with its water access and grazing land. Everything Daniel had dreamed of giving his family. I'm signing it over to you, Jacob said. To Catherine and the children. Legal and proper. No, Catherine said, and Jacob's heart stopped. Not to me and the children. To all of us. Equal shares. If you're staying, if you're going to be part of this family, then you're an equal partner. Not a benefactor, not someone doing us a favor. A partner, Jacob stared at her. Catherine, I can't, that's not, it is, she said firmly. If we're going to do this, we do it right. No one owing anyone, no one holding power over anyone else. Equal partners building something together. That's more than generous. It's fair, Catherine corrected. And it's what Daniel would have wanted. A man who'd work beside him, not for him. A man who'd treat his family as equals. Jacob looked down at the deed, at the legal language that represented so much more than just land. It represented a future, a family. A second chance at the life he'd thrown away 20 years ago. All right, he said quietly. Equal partners. They spent the rest of the day making plans. Jacob described the Northern Valley in detail. What he remembered from Running Bear's descriptions and what he'd learned from surveyor reports over the years. They talked about expansion, about breeding stock, about building a future that would sustain all of them. The children caught their enthusiasm. Emma took notes, her practical mind already organizing and planning. Thomas asked questions about logistics and timing. Sarah mostly just bounced around happily, thrilled that the tension had broken and her family was together again. But as the day wore into evening, Catherine found herself growing quiet. The anger had faded, replaced by something more complicated. Relief that Jacob was staying, yes, but also fear. Because now they were committed to each other in ways that went beyond casual help or temporary arrangement. Now they were building something permanent, and permanent meant vulnerable. After the children were in bed, Catherine found Jacob standing at his usual spot by the window. She came to stand beside him, and they looked out at the star-filled sky in silence. "I meant what I said," Catherine finally spoke, "about needing time to trust you again. I know. I understand. It's not that I don't want to trust you. It's that I'm scared of getting hurt again, of my children getting hurt, of building something on a foundation that might be shaky." Jacob turned to face her. "Then let me prove the foundation is solid, however long it takes. I'm not going anywhere, Catherine. I'm here for as long as you'll have me." She looked up at him, searching his face. "Promise me something. Anything. Promise me that from now on you'll tell me the truth, even when it's hard, even when you're scared of how I'll react. Just be honest with me. That's all I ask. I promise," Jacob said solemnly. "No more secrets. No more waiting for the right time. Just honesty." Catherine nodded slowly, then did something that surprised them both. She stepped forward and rested her forehead against his chest. Not quite an embrace, but contact, connection, a beginning. Jacob's arms came around her carefully, giving her space to pull away if she needed to. But she didn't. She just stood there, letting him hold her, letting herself be held. "We're going to make mistakes," she said quietly. "Both of us. This isn't going to be easy." "No," Jacob agreed. "But nothing worth having ever is." They stood that way for a long moment. Two damaged people learning to trust again, learning to hope again, learning that sometimes the hardest part of love isn't finding it. It's having the courage to hold on to it, even when it's scary. Outside, the Wyoming winter night was cold and clear. But inside the Carter cabin, something was shifting. Not quite healed. Healing would take time, but moving in the right direction. Moving toward spring, toward growth, toward a future none of them could have imagined 6 weeks ago when 3 children found a dying man in the snow. That man was dying no longer. He was alive, fully alive, in ways he hadn't been in 20 years. And the family that had saved him was finding their own salvation in return, in second chances, in forgiveness, in the brave choice to trust again despite the risk. The land deed lay on the table, ready to be filed and made official. But the real deed, the real contract, was being written in these quiet moments of reconciliation and hope. A promise between people to build something together, to try and fail and try again, to be honest even when it hurt, to forgive even when it was hard, to choose love over and over again until it became not just a choice, but a habit, a way of being, a home. And sometimes that was the bravest thing any of them could do. "He's in the barn," Catherine said, trying to keep her voice neutral. "He'll come in when he's ready." But an hour passed, then 2, and Jacob didn't come. Catherine found herself watching the barn door, torn between wanting to go to him and needing him to come to her. Pride and hurt warred with the stubborn fact that she missed him, even angry as she was. Finally, Thomas spoke up. "I'll go get him." Thomas. But the boy was already pulling on his coat. "Mama, whatever happened between you two, it needs to be talked about. And it can't be talked about if you're both avoiding each other." Catherine watched her 9-year-old son walk across the yard with the determined stride of someone much older. When had he grown up so much? When had he learned such wisdom about relationships? In the barn, Jacob was repairing tack that didn't need repairing, just to have something to do with his hands. He looked up when Thomas entered, and the guarded expression on the boy's face made Jacob's heart sink further. "Your mother wants me gone," he said flatly. "She said to come in for breakfast," Thomas corrected. "She didn't say anything about wanting you gone. You heard us fighting last night." "Yeah." Thomas came closer, studying Jacob's face. Emma explained some of it, about the land. About you owning what Papa wanted. Then you know I lied to your mother. To all of you. Did you? Thomas asked. Or did you just not tell us something? Jacob looked at the boy sharply. There's a difference? Maybe, I don't know. I'm 9 years old. I'm still figuring out how adults work. Thomas sat down on a hay bale. But I know this. You could have told us that first day. Could have said, I own land you need, let's make a deal. You didn't. You stayed and helped without asking for anything. I should have told you sooner. Probably, Thomas agreed. But Jacob, everyone messes up. Everyone makes mistakes. Papa used to say what matters isn't the mistake, it's what you do after. Jacob felt his throat tighten. Your father was a wise man? Yeah, he was. Thomas stood up. Come inside. Talk to Mama. Tell her why you waited. She's hurt, but she's not. She doesn't want you to leave. I can tell. How can you tell? Because she's scared, Thomas said simply. And Mama's only scared when she cares about something. When Papa died, she was scared. Now she's scared again. That means you matter. Out of the mouths of babes, Jacob thought. Or in this case, out of the mouth of a boy who'd learned too much about loss too young. They walked back to the cabin together, and Jacob felt like he was walking to his own trial. In a way, he supposed he was. Inside, Catherine was at the stove, her back to the door when they entered. Emma and Sarah sat at the table, both looking worried. The family tableau was so domestic, so normal, and Jacob felt the weight of what he stood to lose. Mama, Thomas said quietly. Jacob's here. Catherine turned slowly, and Jacob saw the evidence of a sleepless night in her eyes. But she'd composed herself, put her armor back on. This would not be easy. Sit down, she said. All of you. Jacob sat, and the children gathered around the table. Catherine poured coffee for herself and Jacob, and then remained standing as if she needed the height advantage for what came next. I've been thinking all night, she began, about what happened, about what it means. She looked directly at Jacob. Tell me again. When did you know about the land? 3 weeks ago. Thomas mentioned the Northern Valley on our trip to town. I put it together then that the land Running Bear left me was the same land Daniel wanted. And you didn't tell me because? Jacob met her eyes. Because I was afraid. Afraid you'd think I'd manipulated the situation. Afraid the children would see me differently. Afraid that if I told you I owned what you needed, everything would change. You'd want me for the land instead of for myself. Or you'd feel obligated to me in ways I didn't want. I wanted to give you the land freely, but I wanted to wait until what? Until we loved you too much to question your motives. Catherine's voice was sharp. No, until I knew you wanted me regardless of the land. Until I could give it as a gift instead of a bargaining chip. But you didn't give me the choice, Catherine said. You made that decision for me. Decided I couldn't be trusted to separate you from what you owned. Decided I was so mercenary that I'd only want you for your property. That's not what I thought, isn't it? Catherine set down a coffee cup with careful precision. Because it sounds like you didn't trust me enough to believe I could see past the land to the man. Didn't trust that my feelings were genuine enough to withstand knowing the truth. Jacob was silent because she was right. He hadn't trusted her. Hadn't trusted that what was growing between them was strong enough to survive the complication the land represented. Emma spoke up quietly. Mr. Brennan, did you plan to give us the land? Yes, Jacob said immediately. I was going to sign it over to your family. No conditions, no strings. Just give it to you. When? That was the question that had no good answer. I don't know, soon. I was trying to find the right way to do it. Or maybe you were trying to find a way to make yourself feel less guilty, Catherine said softly. Maybe you were waiting until you could be sure we'd be so grateful, so indebted, that we wouldn't question why you waited. The words stung because they might have been true. Jacob examined his own motivations with brutal honesty. Had part of him wanted the children to love him first, wanted Catherine to commit to him before revealing he held the solution to their problems. Was there a part of him that had enjoyed being needed for who he was rather than what he had? Maybe, he admitted quietly. Maybe I did want to be loved for myself first. Is that so terrible? No, Catherine said. It's human. But Jacob, the problem is, you didn't give me a chance to prove I could do both. that I could know about the land and still want you for who you are. You didn't trust me enough to let me make that choice. I'm sorry." The words felt inadequate, but they were all he had. "I'm sorry I didn't trust you enough. I'm sorry I kept the secret. I'm sorry I hurt you." Catherine was quiet for a long moment, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "Daniel and I saved for 5 years to buy that land. 5 years of going without, of scraping by, of postponing everything we wanted so we could afford it. And then he died before we could make the purchase." She looked at Jacob with tears in her eyes. "Do you know what it's like to learn that all that sacrifice, all that struggle was for nothing? That the land we needed was owned by someone who didn't even remember he had it, who never used it, never even visited it? Spring came early to the Wyoming territory that year, or maybe it just felt that way, because hope had a way of warming even the coldest days. 3 months had passed since Jacob had forged the iron ring. 3 months of steady work rebuilding trust and building a future. The homestead buzzed with activity. Fence lines extended into the northern valley. A new barn was taking shape, Jacob and Thomas working side by side from dawn to dusk. Emma had started her own medicinal garden, using knowledge from Jacob's journal. And Sarah simply bloomed, secure in the love that surrounded her. But there was one piece of unfinished business, one symbol that needed addressing before they could truly move forward. Catherine stood in the cabin, looking at Daniel's rifle above the mantel, where it had hung for years. Since the night she'd given it to Thomas, the boy had kept it cleaned and oiled, but it had returned to its place of honor. A memorial, a reminder, but also perhaps a barrier. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Emma watching with those 2 knowing eyes. "You're thinking about Papa," Emma said. "It wasn't a question. I'm always thinking about him," Catherine admitted. "But yes, especially today. Today was significant. Today, Jacob was planning to formally propose. They talked about it in the quiet moments they stole together, about making their commitment official, about becoming a blended family in more than just practice. Catherine wanted it, wanted him, but she also felt the weight of loyalty to the man she'd first loved, the man who'd built this home and given her these children. "Emma," she said carefully, "do you think I'm betraying your father by loving Jacob?" Emma came to stand beside her mother, both of them looking at the rifle. "No," she said simply. "I think Papa would want us to be happy, would want you to be happy. And Mama, you are happy now, happier than you've been since he died. But nothing," Emma said with gentle firmness. "Papa's dead, Mama. That's horrible and sad, and we'll always miss him. But we're still alive, and living means more than just surviving. It means choosing joy when we can, choosing love, choosing to build something new while still honoring what came before." Catherine pulled her daughter close, marveling again at her wisdom. "When did you get so smart?" "I had good teachers," Emma said. "Both of them." That evening the family gathered for supper as they always did, but there was a heightened awareness in the air. Everyone could feel that something was coming, some threshold about to be crossed. After the meal was cleared, Catherine stood and called for attention. Her hands were shaking slightly, but her voice was steady. "I have something I want to do," she said, "and I want all of you here for it." She walked to the mantel and lifted down Daniel's rifle. Thomas stood immediately, concern on his face. "Mama, it's all right, sweetheart." Catherine held the rifle with reverent hands. "Your father gave me this rifle shortly after we were married. He said it was for protection, for provision, for taking care of what mattered. And for years he used it to do exactly that, to protect and provide for this family." She looked at each of her children in turn. "After he died, I put it up there as a sort of shrine, a way to keep him close, to honor him. But I think it's time for this rifle to be useful again, not just decorative. Your father wouldn't want it gathering dust. He'd want it being used for what it was made for." Catherine turned to Thomas and held out the rifle. "Son, I gave this to you once before, but you gave it back to hang in Papa's place of honor. Now I'm giving it to you again, and this time I want you to keep it. Use it. Let Jacob teach you everything you need to know. Make it yours. not just as a memorial to your father, but as a tool for your own life. Thomas took the rifle with hands that trembled slightly. "Are you sure, Mama?" "I'm sure." Catherine's voice was thick with emotion. "Your father is in your heart, Thomas, in all our hearts. We don't need a rifle on a wall to remember him. We need to live the way he'd want us to, fully, bravely, looking forward instead of back." She turned to Jacob, who'd been standing quietly to the side. "Jacob, will you teach Thomas everything he needs to know? Will you pass on the knowledge his father would have given him?" Jacob stepped forward, his expression solemn. "It would be my honor. But Catherine, I want to be clear. I'm not replacing Daniel. I'm standing beside his legacy, helping to carry forward what he started." "I know," Catherine said softly. "We all know that." Then she did something that surprised everyone. She reached up and touched the empty space above the mantel where the rifle had hung. "I think," she said slowly, "that this space shouldn't stay empty, but it also shouldn't be a shrine. What if we put something here that represents all of us? Not just the past, but the present and future too." "Like what?" Sarah asked, curious. Catherine looked at Jacob. "What if we put your compass here? The one the children found with you in the snow? It's part of how this family came together. It represents direction, guidance, finding your way home. Isn't that what we're all doing? Finding our way to a new home together?" Jacob felt his throat tighten. That compass, frozen solid when they'd found him, had since thawed and been repaired. It sat in his room, a reminder of where he'd been and how far he'd come. "I think that's perfect," he said quietly. "A symbol of all of us finding our way together." So the compass was retrieved and placed above the mantel, and somehow it felt right. Not erasing Daniel's memory, but expanding the family story to include what came after. Honoring the past while embracing the future. After the children had gone to bed, after Thomas had taken his rifle to his room with pride and purpose, after Emma had kissed both her mother and Jacob goodnight, after Sarah had hugged them both fiercely, Jacob and Catherine stood together in the quiet cabin. "There's something else I want to do," Jacob said. "Something I should have done properly weeks ago." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Inside was another ring, this one different from the iron band Catherine wore on her right hand. This was silver, simple but beautifully crafted, with a small stone. Not a diamond, but a piece of turquoise, the color of mountain sky. "Catherine Carter," Jacob said, and his voice was steady, despite the emotion behind it. "I'm not a man of pretty words or grand gestures. I'm just a man who was lost and found by your family. A man who's learned what it means to hope again, to love again, to believe in tomorrow. I can't promise perfection. I can't promise there won't be hard times. But I can promise this. I will show up. I will try. I will love you and your children with everything I have. I will honor Daniel's memory by being the best man I can be for his family. Will you marry me?" Catherine looked at the ring, at the man holding it, at the life he was offering. She thought about Daniel, about the love they'd shared, and how it had shaped her into who she was. And she thought about Jacob, about the different kind of love growing between them, quieter perhaps, but no less real. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, Jacob Brennan, I'll marry you." He slipped the ring onto her left hand, beside Daniel's gold band. 2 rings, 2 loves, 2 chapters of one life. They didn't contradict each other. They complemented, creating something richer than either alone. They kissed then, and it was different from that first kiss in the barn. This was a promise kept and a promise made. This was the beginning of something official, something permanent, something real. "When?" Jacob asked when they pulled apart. "Spring," Catherine said. "Real spring, when the flowers bloom and the world is new again. We'll have a proper ceremony. Small, just us and maybe a few neighbors. But proper. Spring," Jacob agreed. "I can wait for spring." They stood together by the window, looking out at the land that was theirs now, the valley waiting to be fully developed, the future stretching ahead, full of possibility and work and challenge and joy. "Do you think we can do this?" Catherine asked quietly. "Blend 2 families, 2 pasts into one future?" "I think we're already doing it," Jacob said. "Every day a little more. It won't be perfect, Catherine. There will be days when the kids miss Daniel so much it hurts. Days when I say the wrong thing or make mistakes. Days when you doubt this decision. But, Catherine prompted, but we'll get through them together. That's what family means. Not perfection, but persistence. Not avoiding pain, but walking through it side by side. Catherine leaned her head against his shoulder. My wise mountain man. Hardly wise. Just well practiced at surviving hard things. Though I'd rather thrive than just survive these days. We will, Catherine promised. Thrive, I mean. All of us. The next morning brought a surprise visitor. John Pritchard rode up again, but this time he wasn't alone. 3 other men from the settlement accompanied him, and Catherine felt a flutter of nervousness as she watched them approach. Jacob came out of the barn, wiping his hands on his work pants. The men dismounted, and there was a moment of tense silence before Pritchard spoke. Mrs. Carter, Brennan. He nodded to each of them. We heard news that you two are planning to marry. Catherine lifted her chin. We are? Come spring. Figured as much. Pritchard looked at Jacob with assessing eyes. You planning to stay permanent? Make this your home? I am, Jacob said steadily. If that's a problem, not a problem, Pritchard interrupted. Actually, we came to welcome you proper. To the settlement, to the community. A man who'd worked this hard for a family that isn't even his by blood. Well, that's the kind of neighbor we want. One of the other men stepped forward, extending his hand. Name's William Chen. I run the general store in town. Been watching what you've done with this place these past months. Good work. Solid work. Jacob shook his hand, surprised by the welcome. Thank you. The third man, older and weathered, nodded respectfully. Tom Larson. I knew Daniel Carter. Good man, hard worker. Died too young. He looked at Catherine. He'd be glad you found someone who treats his family right. We can all see Brennan does. Catherine felt tears prick her eyes. She'd been so worried about judgment, about people thinking she was betraying Daniel's memory by moving on. But these men, Daniel's friends and neighbors, were giving their blessing. We wanted to let you know, Pritchard continued, that when you're ready to develop that northern valley, we'll help. Whole community will pitch in. Barn raising, fence building, whatever you need. That's how we do things out here. We take care of our own. I don't know what to say, Jacob admitted, clearly moved. Say you'll come to community gatherings. Say you'll be part of things, not just a hermit on the outskirts. Say you'll let us be neighbors instead of strangers. Jacob glanced at Catherine, who nodded encouragingly. I will, he said, we will. As a family. After the men left, Catherine threw her arms around Jacob, laughing and crying at the same time. Did you hear that? They accept us, accept you. They want us to be part of the community, I heard, Jacob said, holding her close. I didn't expect, I thought there would be judgment, disapproval, maybe from some, Catherine acknowledged. But the people who matter, the people Daniel respected, they see what I see. A good man trying to do right by his family. Thomas had watched the exchange from the barn doorway. He came out now, his expression thoughtful. Jacob, can I ask you something? Always. What do I call you? I mean, after you and Mama get married? You're not my father. But you're not just Jacob anymore either. It was a question Jacob had been waiting for, one he'd thought about carefully. What do you want to call me? Thomas considered. Papa Jacob is what Sarah says. But that feels, I don't know, young. What about just Pa? Emma suggested, joining them. Different from Papa. Your own thing with Jacob, but still family. Thomas tried it out. Pa! He looked at Jacob. Would that be all right with you? Jacob had to swallow hard before he could answer. It would be an honor. Pa, then, Thomas decided. And Jacob when I'm being formal or ornery, which is most of the time, Emma teased. And Thomas shoved her shoulder playfully, and just like that, the tension broke into laughter. That evening, as had become their custom, the family gathered by the fire. But this time, Catherine had something to share. I've been writing, she said, pulling out a leather-bound book. Keeping a record of our family, of what's happened this year. I thought, someday when Sarah is grown, when you children have children of your own, they should know this story. How we came together, how we healed. She opened the book and began to read. The story of the storm, of 3 children finding a dying man, of slow healing and unexpected connection. The mistakes and the forgiveness, the blending of past and present into future. Jacob listened with wonder, hearing their story told in Catherine's clear voice, hearing himself described as brave when he'd felt like a coward, hearing the love that had grown between them documented for posterity. When she finished, Emma spoke up. "That's beautiful, Mama, but you left out one thing. What's that?" "The best part. Where we all are now, happy together, ready for whatever comes next." Catherine smiled and picked up her pen. In careful script, she added one more paragraph, and so this family, born of tragedy and rebuilt through courage, stands on the threshold of spring. Not perfect, but whole. Not without scars, but healed enough to face tomorrow together. Some families are born. Others are forged in the fire of hardship and choice. Ours is both, honoring what was while embracing what is. And that is enough. More than enough. It is everything. She closed the book and looked around at her family. Daniel's children, who were learning to be Jacob's children too. Jacob, who'd been a stranger and was now about to become her husband. This blended, complicated, beautiful family they'd created from the ashes of loss. "To tomorrow," Catherine said, raising her coffee cup in a toast. "To tomorrow," they echoed. And in that moment, surrounded by the people she loved, Catherine Carter knew she'd made the right choice. Not the easy choice, but the right one. The brave one. Outside, winter was finally loosening its grip on the Wyoming territory. Inside the Carter cabin, spring had already arrived, bringing with it the promise of new growth, new life, new love. And in the morning, they would wake and continue the work of building their future, together, as a family, as they were always meant to be. Spring came in full glory to the Wyoming territory, painting the landscape in shades of green and gold that seemed impossible after the long white winter. The wedding was set for the first week of April, when the wildflowers bloomed across the northern valley and the creek ran high with snowmelt. The small church in the settlement was decorated simply, wildflowers Emma had gathered. Branches Thomas had cut and arranged, ribbons Sarah had insisted on adding because weddings need pretty things. The community had turned out in surprising numbers. These frontier families, who understood loss and second chances, who knew that love was precious and rare and worth celebrating whenever it appeared. Catherine wore a dress she'd made herself from fabric Jacob had brought back from his last trip to town, deep blue, the color of mountain sky, with white lace at the collar and cuffs. Her hair was down for once, dark waves touched with silver falling past her shoulders. On her left hand, she wore 2 rings already, Daniel's gold band and Jacob's silver one with its turquoise stone. Today she would add a 3rd, the iron ring Jacob had forged, moved from her right hand to her left to symbolize the completeness of their union. Jacob wore new clothes too, dark trousers, a white shirt, a vest Emma had embroidered with subtle mountain patterns. He looked uncomfortable in the unfamiliar formal wear, but when Catherine appeared in the doorway of the church on Thomas's arm, his face transformed with such obvious love that several women in the congregation dabbed at their eyes. The ceremony was brief and simple, conducted by a traveling preacher who'd agreed to stop in the settlement for the occasion. But when Jacob and Catherine spoke their vows, there was nothing simple about the promises they made. "I, Jacob Brennan, take you, Catherine Carter, to be my wife. I promise to honor the man who came before me, to love the children he gave you, and to build with you a future worthy of the past. I promise to be honest, even when it's hard, to be present, even when it's easier to hide, to choose you and this family every single day for the rest of my life." Catherine's voice was steady, despite the tears streaming down her face. "I, Catherine Carter, take you, Jacob Brennan, to be my husband. I promise to trust you, even when fear whispers doubts. To stand beside you, not behind you or ahead of you, but beside you as an equal partner. To honor your past while building our future. To love you not in spite of your scars, but because of them. Because they made you the man standing before me now." The preacher pronounced them husband and wife. And when Jacob kissed his bride, the church erupted in genuine applause. Thomas whooped despite himself. Emma cried openly. Sarah bounced with excitement, her wooden horse clutched in one hand. The reception was held at the Carter homestead, the Brennan homestead now, officially. Tables had been set up in the yard, and neighbors brought food in abundance. There was music and dancing and laughter, and for a few hours, the hard realities of frontier life faded into pure celebration. John Pritchard raised a glass for a toast. To Jacob and Catherine. May your love be as enduring as the mountains, as nurturing as spring rain, and as warm as summer sun. And may you always remember that you're not alone out here. You've got a community behind you. Hear, hear. The crowd chorused. Later, as the sun began to set, Jacob found himself standing apart from the celebration, looking out at the northern valley where so much of their future waited to be built. Catherine found him there, slipping her hand into his. Regretting it already? She teased gently, not for a second. He turned to face her, this woman who'd saved him in more ways than one. I was just thinking about how impossible this would have seemed 6 months ago. How far we've come. We have a long way still to go, Catherine said. Building a life together isn't something you do in a day. No, Jacob agreed. It's something you do every day, one choice at a time. And Catherine, I choose you. I'll choose you tomorrow and the day after, and every day that follows. She leaned against him, and they stood together watching the sun paint the valley in gold and rose. Behind them, the sounds of celebration continued. Their children playing with other children, their neighbors, their community, sharing in their joy. Your mother would be proud of you, Catherine said quietly. Margaret, I mean. Proud that you found your way back to living, to loving. Jacob thought about the letter he'd finally read, Margaret's words of forgiveness and hope. I think she would be. And Daniel would be grateful you found someone to help carry the load. To love his children. They're your children now too, Catherine reminded him. Our children, Jacob corrected. And the word felt right, perfect. As darkness fell, most of the guests departed, but a few stayed to help clean up. Emma directed operations with her usual efficiency. Thomas worked alongside Jacob, their movements synchronized from months of shared labor. Sarah had fallen asleep on a bench, Thunder the wooden horse still clutched in her small hand. Jacob carried Sarah inside and tucked her into bed. And the simple act of putting a child to sleep, something he hadn't done in 22 years, filled him with quiet joy. Emma and Thomas followed shortly after, exhausted but happy. Finally, Jacob and Catherine were alone in the cabin that was truly theirs now. Catherine had moved Jacob's few belongings into the main bedroom earlier, had made space for him in the life she'd built. It was symbolic and practical at once. No more sleeping separately, no more holding back. They were married, committed, all in, nervous, Jacob asked as they prepared for bed. A little, Catherine admitted. It's been a long time since I shared this room with anyone, since I was close to someone like this. For me, too. 22 years. Jacob sat on the edge of the bed. We don't have to rush anything. We can take this as slow as you need. Catherine smiled and came to stand between his knees, her hands resting on his shoulders. Jacob Brennan, we just got married. I think the time for taking it slow has passed. He pulled her close, and they kissed with the freedom of people who belong to each other now, fully and completely. There was tenderness and passion both. The careful exploration of two people learning each other, learning how to be together. Later, lying in the darkness with Catherine curled against his side, Jacob felt a peace so profound it was almost overwhelming. This was what he'd thrown away 22 years ago. This simple intimacy, this quiet joy of sharing your life with someone who knew you and loved you anyway. Thank you, he whispered into the darkness. For what? For taking a chance on a half-frozen stranger your children dragged home. For being brave enough to trust again. For letting me be part of this family. Catherine propped herself up on one elbow, looking at him in the faint moonlight filtering through the window. Jacob, you're not part of this family. You are this family. We're not the Carters anymore, with you as an addition. We're the Brennans. All of us together, the Brennans. Jacob tested the name in his mind and found it fit perfectly. Not erasing the past, but building on it. Creating something new that honored what came before. The Brennans, he repeated. I like that. So do I, Catherine said, settling back against him. Now go to sleep, husband. Tomorrow starts our real work. What work is that? Living, Catherine said simply. Building our life together. Raising our children. Developing the valley. Growing old side by side. All of it. Sounds perfect, Jacob murmured, already drifting toward sleep. The next morning, life returned to its rhythms. But everything was different. Small differences, but profound ones. Catherine and Jacob worked side by side with the easy coordination of partners. The children called him Pa without hesitation. When neighbors stopped by, they were greeted as the Brennan family, no qualifiers needed. Over the following weeks and months, they developed the Northern Valley together, built the new barn with help from the community, moved half the herd to the better grazing land, planted crops and gardens, created something that would sustain them for years to come. One evening in late summer, as they all sat on the porch watching the sun set over their expanded homestead, Thomas spoke up. Pa, do you ever miss it? The mountains? Being alone? Jacob considered the question carefully. Sometimes, he admitted. There's a simplicity to that life that has its appeal. But Thomas, I was alone, not free. There's a difference. Now I'm free. Free to be part of something larger than myself. Free to love and be loved. Free to have a purpose beyond just surviving another season. Do you think you'll ever go back? Even for a visit? Maybe someday, Jacob said. But not alone. If I go, we'll all go. I'll show you the high country, teach you everything Thomas Running Bear taught me. But I'll always come back here. Because this is home now. Emma looked up from the plant journal she was working on. Home isn't a place, though. It's people. That's exactly right, Catherine said, reaching over to squeeze Jacob's hand. Home is who you're with, not where you are. Sarah, now 7 and full of questions, piped up. When I grow up, will I remember finding you in the snow? Jacob lifted her onto his lap. I hope so. That's an important part of our family story. Tell it again, Sarah demanded, as she had countless times before. So Jacob told the story. How 3 brave children had found a dying man and refused to leave him behind. How they dragged him home through the snow. How their mother had worked through the night to save his life. How slowly, carefully, they'd all saved each other. And then you stayed, Sarah prompted, knowing her favorite part was coming. And then I stayed, Jacob confirmed. Because sometimes the family you need finds you when you least expect it. And sometimes being saved and being a savior are exactly the same thing. As the stars came out over the Wyoming territory, the Brennan family sat together in comfortable silence. Jacob held Sarah on his lap, his arm around Catherine's shoulders. Thomas sat nearby, Daniel's rifle across his knees, taking his turn at watch. Emma worked on her journal, documenting the day's activities for future generations. This was what happiness looked like, Jacob thought. Not perfect, never perfect, but real, honest, full of love and purpose and the simple satisfaction of a day well lived. He looked at the compass mounted above the mantel, visible through the open door. Once frozen and pointing nowhere, now thawed and true, showing him the direction he needed to go. North wasn't up into the mountains anymore. North was right here, with these people in this life they'd built together. Catherine caught his eye and smiled. And in that smile was everything, love and partnership and the promise of all the tomorrows ahead. There would be hard times still. Winters would be harsh, losses would come, challenges would test them, but they would face them together as a family, as they were meant to be. I love you, Jacob said quietly, for perhaps the 100th time since they'd married, but it never got old saying it or hearing it. I love you too, Catherine replied. And those simple words contained multitudes. The children echoed the sentiment in their own ways, Thomas with a gruff nod, Emma with a soft, love you, Pa, Sarah with an enthusiastic hug. And as the summer night deepened and the family gradually made their way inside to bed, Jacob Brennan took one last look at the land spreading out before him. The homestead he'd helped build, the valley they'd develop, the future stretching ahead, rich with possibility. He'd come to this place dying, frozen in more ways than one, a ghost of a man existing without really living. The Carter children had found him and saved his body. But Catherine and her family had done something even more remarkable. They'd saved his soul, given him reason to hope again, to love again, to believe that maybe, just maybe, He deserved a second chance at happiness, and he'd given them something in return. Not just labor or land or practical help, but commitment, partnership, a father for children who needed one, a husband for a woman who deserved one, a family member who showed up and stayed and chose them every single day. Some families were born, bound by blood and circumstance. Others were forged, shaped by choice and commitment and the brave decision to trust again, despite all the ways it could hurt. The Brennan family was both, built on the foundation Daniel Carter had laid, expanded by the love Jacob brought, held together by the courage it took to blend old and new into something entirely their own. As Jacob closed the door against the night and turned to his family, his wife, his children, his home, he felt grateful beyond measure. Grateful for storms that had brought him to this place. Grateful for children brave enough to help a stranger. Grateful for a woman strong enough to risk loving again. Grateful for second chances and new beginnings and the possibility of redemption. Sometimes the hardest thing in life isn't surviving the storm. It's learning to let someone in after you've been alone for so long. And sometimes the family you need finds you when you least expect it, buried in snow and dying, and brings you home. Jacob Brennan had finally found his home, and he would spend the rest of his life being worthy of it.